Picture yourself standing at the edge of a towering cliff. You feel the wind on your face, see the vast emptiness below, and suddenly experience something strange. It is not just fear of falling, though that is certainly present. It is something far more unsettling, something that seems to come from within yourself rather than from the external danger. You realize in that moment that you could choose to jump. The power is entirely in your hands, and that recognition fills you with a dizzying sensation that has no name. This sensation, this dizzying confrontation with your own freedom, is what Kierkegaard called anxiety. But for him, anxiety was not a mental illness to be cured or a weakness to be overcome. It was the very foundation of human consciousness, the birthplace of authentic existence, and the gateway to genuine selfhood. Anxiety, in Kierkegaard's revolutionary understanding, is nothing less than the awareness of freedom itself. Written under the mysterious pseudonym Vigilius Haufniensis, which means Watchman of Copenhagen in Latin, this work emerged from the mind of a man who understood suffering intimately. Kierkegaard had broken off his engagement to the young Regine Olsen, believing himself too melancholy and strange for normal human relationships. He had witnessed the death of 5 siblings and lived under what his father believed to be a family curse. Yet from this personal darkness came insights that would illuminate the human condition for generations to come. The work carries the ambitious subtitle, A Simple Psychologically Orienting Deliberation on the Dogmatic Issue of Hereditary Sin. Do not let this theological language fool you into thinking this is merely religious doctrine. Kierkegaard used the story of Adam and Eve as a mirror to reflect universal truths about human psychology, moral development, and the birth of consciousness itself. He transformed ancient theology into modern psychology, creating insights that remain as fresh and relevant today as they were nearly 2 centuries ago. We will explore why anxiety is fundamentally different from fear, how freedom creates its own unique form of suffering, and why learning to be anxious in the right way might be the most important lesson of human life. We will discover how Kierkegaard's insights shaped modern existential therapy, influenced neuroscientific research, and continue to offer hope and understanding to those struggling with the fundamental challenges of being human. Most importantly, we will learn why anxiety, properly understood, is not the enemy of happiness, but its essential prerequisite. Part 1. The revolutionary context, breaking free from systematic philosophy. To understand the revolutionary nature of Kierkegaard's work on anxiety, we must first grasp the intellectual world he was rebelling against. Imagine living in an age where the greatest minds believed they could explain everything through grand, all-encompassing systems of thought. This was the world of German idealism, dominated by towering figures like Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, who claimed to have constructed a complete philosophical system that could account for all of reality. According to Hegel, everything in existence followed logical patterns that human reason could ultimately comprehend and organize into perfect systematic knowledge. For Hegel and his followers, individual human experience was merely a small part of this grand cosmic system. Personal struggles, individual choices and subjective feelings were seen as temporary disruptions in the march toward absolute knowledge. The goal of philosophy was to rise above the messy particulars of individual existence and achieve an objective, godlike perspective on reality as a whole. Human beings were important only insofar as they contributed to this grand universal consciousness that was supposedly working itself out through history. But Søren Kierkegaard looked at this magnificent intellectual edifice and saw something fundamentally wrong. Where others saw systematic beauty, he saw a catastrophic misunderstanding of what it means to be human. The problem was not that these systems were intellectually flawed, though he certainly had criticisms of their logic. The problem was that they completely missed the point of human existence itself. Kierkegaard realized that human beings are not abstract thinking machines designed to contemplate eternal truths. We are flesh and blood creatures who must make concrete choices in specific situations without ever having complete knowledge of the consequences. We love and hate, hope and despair, commit ourselves to relationships and projects that might fail, and face the constant uncertainty of not knowing what the future holds. Most importantly, we must choose who to become without any guarantee that our choices are correct. This is where anxiety enters the picture as something completely different from what systematic philosophy could comprehend. Anxiety is not a problem to be solved through better thinking or more complete knowledge. It is the fundamental emotional reality of creatures who are free but finite, who must choose but cannot know with certainty the results of their choices. Anxiety reveals something about human existence that no systematic philosophy could capture, the irreducible reality of individual subjective experience. Consider the difference between reading about love in a philosophy book and actually falling in love yourself. The philosophical account might be logically perfect, but it completely misses the lived reality of having your heart race when you see a particular person, of losing sleep wondering if they care about you, of making yourself vulnerable in ways that terrify and exhilarate you simultaneously. This lived subjective experience is what Kierkegaard called existence with a capital E. And anxiety is the emotional signature of this existence, the feeling that accompanies every genuine human choice. Kierkegaard's opposition to systematic philosophy was not merely academic, but deeply personal. He had grown up in a household dominated by his father's intense religious melancholy and had experienced firsthand the gap between abstract religious doctrine and the lived reality of faith. He had studied theology and philosophy at the University of Copenhagen, but found that all his learning could not help him navigate the most basic human challenges. How do you choose whether to marry someone you love but believe you might hurt? How do you live with the weight of moral responsibility when you cannot know the full consequences of your actions? How do you maintain faith in meaning and purpose when suffering and uncertainty seem to dominate human experience? These were not problems that could be solved by building better philosophical systems. They were existential realities that each individual had to face alone, in the privacy of their own subjective experience. And anxiety was the emotional reality that accompanied this confrontation with the fundamental uncertainties of human existence. Rather than trying to eliminate anxiety through systematic knowledge, Kierkegaard proposed that we needed to understand it as a teacher that could guide us toward authentic human existence. The Denmark of Kierkegaard's time was experiencing rapid social and intellectual change. The old certainties of traditional Christianity were being challenged by modern science and philosophy, but the proposed replacements seemed to lose something essential about human experience. People were becoming more educated and sophisticated, but also more anxious and disconnected from sources of meaning and purpose. Kierkegaard diagnosed this as the inevitable result of trying to live human life according to abstract principles rather than embracing the irreducible complexity of individual existence. In this context, the concept of anxiety represented a completely new approach to understanding human psychology. Instead of trying to fit human experience into predetermined systematic categories, Kierkegaard proposed to start with the actual lived experience of anxiety and see what it could teach us about the nature of human existence. This was the beginning of what would later be called existential psychology, a movement that would profoundly influence modern psychotherapy, psychiatry, and our understanding of mental health. But in Kierkegaard's time, it was a radical departure from accepted ways of thinking about human nature and psychological experience. The choice of the pseudonym Vigilius Haufniensis, Watchman of Copenhagen, was significant in this context. A watchman stands guard, alert to dangers that others might miss, prepared to sound the alarm when trouble approaches. Kierkegaard saw himself as standing watch over the spiritual and psychological health of his city and his age, warning against the dangers of losing touch with authentic human existence. The systematic philosophers were building impressive intellectual structures, but they were missing the cries of actual human beings struggling with the real challenges of existence. Anxiety, in this revolutionary framework, became not a sign of human weakness but a sign of human greatness. Only creatures capable of freedom could experience anxiety, because anxiety is precisely the emotional experience of confronting the weight and responsibility of choice. Animals, operating purely on instinct, do not experience anxiety in Kierkegaard's sense because they do not face genuine alternatives. Angels, if they exist, would not experience anxiety because their choices would be made with perfect knowledge and wisdom. But human beings, suspended between the automatic responses of animals and the perfect knowledge of angels, experience anxiety as the emotional reality of their unique position in existence. This anxiety is not a bug in the system of human nature, but a feature, a sign that we are the kinds of beings capable of authentic choice and genuine moral responsibility. Part 2. Fear has an object, anxiety has freedom, the fundamental distinction. Most people use the words fear and anxiety interchangeably, but Kierkegaard discovered a difference so profound it changes everything we think we know about human psychology. Understanding this distinction is like having a key that unlocks the deepest mysteries of human consciousness. Fear, in Kierkegaard's analysis, always has a specific object. You fear the growling dog, the approaching storm, the results of your medical test, or the possibility of losing your job. Fear points outward towards something in the world that threatens you, something you can name and potentially address through concrete action. You can run from the dog, seek shelter from the storm, or take steps to improve your job performance. But anxiety operates in a completely different dimension of human experience. When you feel anxious in Kierkegaard's sense, you cannot point to any specific external threat. Instead, you are confronting something far more fundamental and far more unsettling, the sheer scope of your own freedom. Anxiety is what you feel when you realize that your life is not predetermined, that the future is genuinely open, and that your choices matter in ways you cannot fully comprehend. Think about the last time you faced a major life decision. Perhaps you were choosing between job offers, deciding whether to end a relationship, or contemplating a move to a new city. The specific practical considerations, fear of financial insecurity, worry about hurting someone's feelings, concern about leaving familiar surroundings, were probably easy to identify. But beneath these concrete fears, you likely felt something else. A deeper unease about the very fact that the choice was yours to make. This deeper feeling, this confrontation with the weight of your own agency, was anxiety in Kierkegaard's sense. You were experiencing the dizziness that comes from looking into the abyss of your own freedom. Kierkegaard used the image of a man standing at the edge of a cliff to illustrate this distinction perfectly. The fear is obvious. You might fall to your death through accident or misfortune. But the anxiety is more subtle and more disturbing. You realize that you could choose to jump. The power to end your own life, to make the ultimate choice, rests entirely in your own hands. This recognition fills you with a strange combination of attraction and repulsion, fascination and horror. You are simultaneously drawn to the ultimate expression of your freedom and terrified by the responsibility it represents. This paradoxical structure, what Kierkegaard called sympathetic antipathy and antipathetic sympathy, reveals something crucial about human nature. We are the kinds of beings who are both attracted to and frightened by our own capacity for choice. We want to be free, but freedom brings with it a burden that sometimes feels overwhelming. We desire authentic existence, but authenticity requires taking responsibility for ourselves in ways that can be terrifying. Modern psychology has largely confirmed Kierkegaard's insight about this distinction, though often without recognizing its source. Clinical anxiety disorders typically involve worry about specific future events or general feelings of threat and danger. But existential anxiety, the kind that Kierkegaard analyzed, involves something deeper, the individual's relationship to their own freedom and responsibility. This is why traditional anxiety treatments, which focus on managing specific fears and worries, sometimes miss the mark when dealing with people struggling with fundamental questions about meaning, purpose, and authentic existence. Consider how different these two types of anxiety feel in your own life. When you are afraid of something specific, your mind naturally focuses on problem solving. What can you do to avoid or address the threat? But when you experience existential anxiety, the feeling is more like vertigo. You feel unsteady, not because of any external danger, but because you are confronting the groundlessness of human existence itself. There is no clear problem to solve because the problem is actually the human condition. The fact that we must choose without certainty, commit without guarantees, and take responsibility for lives we never fully control. This distinction helps explain why anxiety often intensifies during periods of transition and growth. When you graduate from school, start a new career, enter or leave a relationship, or face any major life change, you are confronting new possibilities for self-definition. The old patterns and roles that gave your life structure are no longer sufficient, and you must choose who you want to become. This process of self-creation is simultaneously exciting and terrifying because it forces you to acknowledge your own agency in shaping your existence. Kierkegaard also recognized that anxiety has a temporal dimension that distinguishes it from fear. Fear typically focuses on immediate or near-future threats, but anxiety opens up the entire scope of possibility. When you feel anxious, you are not just worried about what might happen tomorrow or next week. You are confronting the open-ended nature of your future, the fact that your choices today will ripple forward in ways you cannot predict or control. This temporal dimension of anxiety explains why it often feels more overwhelming than specific fears. You are grappling not with a particular threat, but with the uncertainty that characterizes human existence as such. The genius of Kierkegaard's analysis lies in recognizing that this anxiety, despite being uncomfortable and sometimes overwhelming, is actually a sign of human greatness. Only beings capable of transcending their immediate circumstances, of imagining alternative possibilities, and of taking responsibility for their own development could experience anxiety in this existential sense. Animals living purely by instinct do not lie awake at night wondering if they are living authentic lives or whether their choices align with their deepest values. But human beings, blessed and cursed with self-consciousness and freedom, must navigate these deeper questions throughout their lives. Anxiety is the emotional signature of this uniquely human predicament, the feeling that accompanies our confrontation with the burden and privilege of self-creation. Part 3. The Dizziness of Freedom, standing at the edge of infinite possibility. Anxiety is the dizziness of freedom. These 6 words contain perhaps the most profound insight into human psychology ever articulated. But what does it really mean to experience freedom as dizziness? And why does this feeling arise at the most crucial moments of human existence? To understand this, we need to dive deep into Kierkegaard's analysis of what happens in the human soul when we truly confront the scope of our own agency. Picture yourself standing on the observation deck of a very tall building. As you look down at the street far below, you experience a physical sensation of dizziness that seems to come from the disconnect between your current position and the vast space stretching beneath you. Your body responds to this height by making you feel unsteady, uncertain about your balance and your safety. Now imagine that this physical sensation has a psychological equivalent that occurs not when you look down from a building, but when you look forward into the open possibilities of your own future. This psychological dizziness is what Kierkegaard meant by the dizziness of freedom. It is the feeling that arises when you realize that your life is not following a predetermined script, that the future is genuinely open, and that your choices will determine who you become. Just as physical dizziness makes you feel unsteady on your feet, existential dizziness makes you feel unsteady in your very identity. Who are you, really, if you are not simply the product of your circumstances, your genetics, or your social conditioning? Who will you become if the choice is really up to you? These questions do not have easy answers, and the uncertainty they create manifests as the emotional experience we call anxiety. Kierkegaard understood that this dizziness intensifies at moments when our freedom becomes most apparent. Think about the experience of falling in love. Suddenly, you're faced with choices that will fundamentally alter the trajectory of your life. Do you open yourself to this person, making yourself vulnerable to both joy and heartbreak? Do you commit to building a shared future with someone whose inner life you can never fully know? Do you risk changing who you are for the sake of who you might become together? The intensity of romantic anxiety comes not just from uncertainty about the other person's feelings, but from confronting your own capacity to transform your entire existence through the choices you make about love. The same dizziness arises when you choose a career, decide whether to have children, or face any situation that calls upon you to define yourself through action. Each genuine choice is a kind of leap into the unknown because you cannot know in advance who you will become as a result of your decision. You can gather information, weigh pros and cons, and consult with others, but ultimately you must act without complete knowledge of the consequences. This gap between choice and knowledge is where anxiety lives. You feel dizzy because you are looking into a future that is genuinely open, genuinely undetermined, and genuinely dependent on decisions you must make without certainty. But Kierkegaard discovered something remarkable about this dizziness. It contains both attraction and repulsion in equal measure. When you stand at the edge of a cliff and realize you could choose to jump, you do not simply feel fear. You also feel a strange fascination with the possibility, a pull toward the ultimate expression of your own agency. This is not because you actually want to die, but because some part of you is drawn to the sheer power of choice itself. The same dynamic occurs in less dramatic situations throughout your life. You might feel simultaneously attracted to and frightened by the possibility of quitting your job to pursue a dream, ending a comfortable but unfulfilling relationship, or making any choice that would require you to take full responsibility for your own existence. This paradoxical structure of anxiety, sympathetic antipathy, and antipathetic sympathy reveals something profound about human nature. We are beings who long for authentic existence but are frightened by what authenticity requires. We want to be free but often prefer the security of predetermined roles and expectations. We desire to create ourselves but are overwhelmed by the responsibility that self-creation entails. Anxiety is the emotional expression of this fundamental tension at the heart of human existence. Modern psychology has extensively documented what it calls choice overload, the way that having too many options can lead to decision paralysis and increased anxiety. But Kierkegaard's insight goes deeper than the practical difficulties of choosing among alternatives. The anxiety he described arises not from having too many choices, but from the recognition that choice itself is the fundamental structure of human existence. Even when your options are limited, you still face the basic existential reality that you must choose who to be and how to live. You cannot escape this responsibility by appealing to external authorities because ultimately you must choose which authorities to trust and how to interpret their guidance. This is why anxiety often intensifies during periods when external structures of meaning and guidance become less reliable. When traditional religious beliefs, social conventions or cultural narratives lose their power to provide automatic answers to life's fundamental questions, individuals must take more responsibility for creating their own meaning and direction. The resulting anxiety is not a sign of weakness or pathology, but a natural response to the increased burden of self-determination. In a sense, anxiety is the price we pay for living in a world where authentic existence is possible. Kierkegaard also recognized that the dizziness of freedom has a temporal dimension that makes it particularly intense. When you make a significant choice, you are not just deciding what to do in the present moment. You are also choosing who you will become in the future, setting in motion a chain of consequences that will extend far beyond your current ability to predict or control. The weight of this temporal responsibility, the recognition that your present choices will shape your future self, adds an additional layer to the dizziness of freedom. You are not just choosing an action, you are choosing a destiny, and you must do so without knowing exactly where that destiny will lead. Yet Kierkegaard insisted that this dizziness, despite its discomfort, is actually a gift. It is the emotional signature of our capacity for authentic existence, the feeling that accompanies our ability to transcend our circumstances and create ourselves through our choices. Without anxiety, we would be either animals driven by instinct or angels guided by perfect knowledge. But as human beings, we occupy a unique position in existence. We are capable of freedom, but must exercise that freedom without certainty. The dizziness we feel when confronting this reality is not a mistake to be corrected, but a teacher to be heeded, a guide that can lead us toward more authentic and meaningful lives. Part 4. The Garden of Eden as Psychology. Reinterpreting the Fall. When Kierkegaard turned his attention to the biblical story of Adam and Eve, he was not interested in defending traditional theology or debating historical accuracy. Instead, he saw in this ancient narrative a perfect psychological portrait of how human consciousness develops and how moral responsibility is born. By reinterpreting the fall as a story about the emergence of self-awareness, rather than a historical event about disobedience, Kierkegaard revealed universal truths about human development that remain as relevant today as they were in his time. Every human being, in a sense, recapitulates the journey from innocence to knowledge that the story of Eden describes. In Kierkegaard's reading, Adam before the fall represents the state of innocence that characterizes early human consciousness. This innocence is not moral goodness in the usual sense, because genuine morality requires the ability to choose between good and evil. Instead, innocence is a state of immediate unity with oneself and one's environment, a condition in which the gap between desire and action, thought and reality, has not yet opened up. Think of a very young child who acts spontaneously without self-consciousness or internal conflict. The child is neither good nor evil in a moral sense, but simply exists in a state of natural harmony with their immediate impulses and surroundings. But this state of innocence, however peaceful it might seem, contains within itself the seeds of its own destruction. The moment God tells Adam not to eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, something profound happens in human consciousness. For the first time, Adam becomes aware that there are alternatives to his current state of being. The prohibition does not just forbid a particular action, it opens up the entire realm of possibility by making Adam aware that he could choose to disobey. This awareness of choice, this recognition that alternatives exist, is the birth of human freedom, and simultaneously the death of innocence. Here is where Kierkegaard's psychological genius becomes apparent. Adam cannot understand what good and evil mean because he has not yet experienced them. The prohibition is therefore not really about the content of the command, but about the form of choice itself. When God says, "Do not eat from this tree," Adam does not comprehend the moral significance of obedience or disobedience. Instead, he experiences something entirely new, the dizzying recognition that he has the power to determine his own actions. This recognition fills him with anxiety because he is confronting the awesome responsibility of freedom without having any framework for understanding what that responsibility means. Kierkegaard describes this moment as Adam looking into the alarming possibility of being able. Suddenly Adam is aware that he is not simply a creature of instinct or natural necessity. He has the capacity to choose, to determine his own course of action, to shape his own existence. This recognition is simultaneously exhilarating and terrifying because it places the burden of self-determination squarely on his own shoulders. The anxiety Adam feels is not fear of punishment for disobedience, but the deeper existential anxiety that comes from confronting the scope of his own agency. In Kierkegaard's interpretation, the serpent in the garden represents not an external tempter, but a psychological projection of Adam's own internal state. The serpent's promise that eating the fruit will make Adam like God, knowing good and evil, reflects Adam's dawning awareness of his own capacity for self-determination. The temptation is not really about fruit, but about the desire to actualize the freedom that the prohibition has made visible. Adam is drawn to disobey not because he wants to rebel against God, but because he is fascinated by his own power to choose. The serpent's voice is really the voice of human freedom itself, calling Adam to take responsibility for his own existence. The moment of eating the fruit represents what Kierkegaard called the leap. It is the transition from innocence to experience, from automatic existence to self-conscious choice. This transition cannot happen gradually or logically because it involves a qualitative change in the structure of consciousness itself. One moment, Adam exists in immediate unity with his surroundings. The next moment, he is a self-conscious being capable of reflection, choice, and moral responsibility. The leap is instantaneous and irreversible because you cannot unknow the knowledge of your own freedom once you have acquired it. But here is the crucial point that Kierkegaard emphasized. The fall is not a mistake or a tragedy to be regretted. It is the necessary condition for authentic human existence. Without the capacity for choice that the fall represents, Adam would remain forever in a state of unconscious innocence, neither good nor evil, neither free nor responsible. The anxiety that accompanies the recognition of freedom is not a sign that something has gone wrong, but evidence that something essentially human has been born. Consciousness, choice, moral responsibility, and the possibility of authentic existence all emerge together in the moment when innocence is lost and freedom is discovered. This psychological reading of the fall explains why every human being must recapitulate this journey in their own development. Each of us begins life in a state of relative innocence, acting spontaneously without full awareness of the implications of our choices. But gradually, through experience and reflection, we become aware of our own agency and the weight of responsibility it carries. The anxiety that often accompanies adolescence and young adulthood reflects this same confrontation with freedom that Adam experienced in the garden. We discover that we are not simply products of our upbringing or our circumstances, but beings capable of shaping our own existence through the choices we make. Kierkegaard's interpretation also explains why traditional attempts to return to innocence through ignorance or denial are ultimately futile. Once you have tasted the fruit of self-consciousness, you cannot go back to unconscious existence. The only path forward is to embrace the anxiety that comes with freedom and learn to use it as a guide toward authentic existence. This is why Kierkegaard insisted that the goal is not to eliminate anxiety, but to learn to be anxious in the right way. Anxiety is the emotional signature of our capacity for choice, and learning to work with it constructively is essential to human flourishing. Modern developmental psychology has confirmed many of Kierkegaard's insights about the transition from innocence to self-consciousness. Research on childhood development shows that the emergence of self-awareness, moral reasoning, and the capacity for genuine choice follows predictable patterns that mirror the psychological journey Kierkegaard described. The anxiety that often accompanies these developmental transitions is not pathological but adaptive, helping individuals navigate the complex process of becoming self-determining agents. Understanding this process through Kierkegaard's lens can help us appreciate anxiety not as a sign of weakness, but as evidence of our uniquely human capacity for growth and self-creation. Part 5. The Leap: How Authentic Choice Transcends Logical Analysis. One of Kierkegaard's most revolutionary insights concerns the nature of genuine choice itself. He discovered that the most important decisions in human life cannot be made through logical analysis alone, but require something he called the leap. This concept of the leap fundamentally challenges our modern assumption that rational thinking can solve all human problems and points toward a deeper understanding of how authentic existence actually works. To grasp what Kierkegaard meant by the leap, we need to examine why some choices transcend the boundaries of pure reason and require a different kind of human capacity. Think about the most significant decisions you have made in your life. Choosing a life partner, deciding on a career path, committing to having children, or embracing a particular set of values or beliefs. In each case, you probably gathered information, weighed pros and cons, and thought carefully about the implications of your choice. But if you are honest about the actual moment of decision, you will recognize that something else was required beyond logical analysis. At some point you had to stop thinking and start acting, even though your reasoning could have continued indefinitely without reaching a definitive conclusion. This transition from reflection to action, from possibility to actuality, is what Kierkegaard called the leap. The leap is necessary because the most important human choices involve what Kierkegaard called qualitative rather than quantitative differences. When you decide between two job offers with different salaries, you can make a quantitative comparison based on concrete factors like money, benefits, and working conditions. But when you decide whether to commit your life to another person in marriage, you are not just choosing between alternatives, but choosing to become a different kind of person. The married version of yourself will have different priorities, responsibilities, and possibilities than the unmarried version. You cannot predict with certainty who you will become through this choice, because the choice itself will transform you in ways that rational analysis cannot fully anticipate. This is why Kierkegaard insisted that reflection, despite being crucial and necessary, has a kind of inner infinity that makes it unsuitable for actual decision-making. A person thinking about a decision can always go on thinking, considering new angles, imagining additional possibilities, and refining their analysis. But while reflection continues, life does not wait. Opportunities disappear, circumstances change, and the very process of endless thinking can become a way of avoiding the responsibility that comes with definitive choice. At some point you must will to stop the process of reflection and identify with a particular possibility that you choose to actualize. This willing to act despite uncertainty is the essence of the leap. Kierkegaard's analysis of the leap helps explain why anxiety often intensifies at moments of important decision-making. The anxiety arises not just from uncertainty about the consequences of your choice, but from the recognition that you must choose without complete knowledge. The leap requires you to take responsibility for an outcome you cannot fully predict or control. You must act on the basis of partial information, limited understanding, and uncertain prospects for success. This gap between knowledge and action, between reflection and commitment, is where anxiety lives most intensely. You feel anxious because you're about to make a choice that will define you without being able to guarantee that your self-definition will be successful or wise. But Kierkegaard discovered that this apparent limitation of human reason is actually pointing towards something deeper and more important about human existence. The fact that our most significant choices cannot be made through logic alone does not mean they are arbitrary or irrational. Instead, it means they engage aspects of human nature that transcend pure reasoning. Your capacity for commitment, your willingness to take responsibility, your ability to act on faith in the face of uncertainty. The leap reveals that authentic human existence requires not just intelligence but also courage, not just analysis, but also trust in your own capacity to grow and adapt to the consequences of your choices. Consider how this applies to the choice to have children. No amount of rational analysis can fully prepare you for the reality of parenthood, because becoming a parent fundamentally transforms who you are. You can read books, talk to other parents, and imagine what the experience might be like, but the actual reality of caring for a completely dependent human being will engage aspects of yourself you never knew existed. The choice to have children is therefore necessarily a leap into the unknown, a commitment to become someone you have never been for the sake of someone who does not yet exist. The anxiety that often accompanies this choice reflects the magnitude of the transformation it represents and the impossibility of making it on purely rational grounds. The same logic applies to all genuine commitments in human life. When you choose a career, you're not just selecting a job, but choosing to develop certain capacities and interests while potentially neglecting others. When you commit to a romantic relationship, you're not just choosing a companion, but choosing to become the kind of person who can sustain love over time through all the unpredictable challenges that life will bring. When you embrace a particular set of values or beliefs, you are not just agreeing with certain propositions, but choosing to orient your entire existence around principles whose full implications you cannot foresee. Each of these choices requires a leap because it involves becoming someone you have never been before. Kierkegaard's insight about the leap also explains why genuine choice cannot be delegated to others or reduced to following predetermined rules. Other people can offer advice, and moral principles can provide guidance, but ultimately you must choose which advice to follow and how to interpret and apply moral principles to your particular situation. Even the choice to follow external authority is itself a choice that you must make and for which you remain responsible. This irreducible element of personal responsibility is what makes human existence both terrifying and magnificent. You cannot escape the burden of choice by appealing to external authorities, because you must always choose which authorities to trust and how to understand their guidance. The leap also has a temporal dimension that adds to its complexity. When you make a significant choice, you are not just deciding what to do in the present moment, but committing to a future course of action based on who you are right now. But you will inevitably change and grow over time, which means your future self may have different priorities and perspectives than your current self. The leap, therefore, requires a kind of faith in your own capacity to remain committed to choices made under conditions of uncertainty and change. You must trust that you will be able to honor your commitments even as you evolve and discover new aspects of yourself and your situation. Yet Kierkegaard insisted that this element of uncertainty and faith in human choice is not a bug, but a feature of authentic existence. The leap reveals that we are beings capable of transcending our current circumstances and creating ourselves through our choices. The anxiety we feel when facing the necessity of leaping is not a sign that something is wrong, but evidence of our capacity for genuine freedom and authentic self-determination. Learning to make these leaps courageously and responsibly is not just a practical skill, but the very essence of what it means to live a fully human life. Part 6. The Paradox of Innocence and Knowledge, Why We Cannot Go Back. There is something heartbreaking about the loss of innocence and something magnificent about the gain of knowledge. Kierkegaard understood that human development involves a fundamental paradox. We must lose something precious in order to gain something essential. The transition from innocence to self-consciousness is both a loss and a gain, a fall and a rise, a tragedy and a triumph. Understanding this paradox is crucial for grasping why anxiety is an inevitable part of human existence and why attempts to return to unconscious innocence are both impossible and ultimately undesirable. Innocence, in Kierkegaard's analysis, is characterized by a kind of blessed unconsciousness. The innocent person acts spontaneously without internal conflict, self-doubt, or the burden of moral responsibility. Think of a young child playing in a garden, completely absorbed in the immediate joy of discovery and exploration. The child does not question whether their play is meaningful, worry about whether they are using their time wisely, or wonder if their happiness is justified. They simply exist, in a state of natural harmony with their immediate experience, free from the complications that self-consciousness brings. This state has a beauty and peace that we often long to recapture in our more complex adult lives. But innocence, despite its beauty, is also a form of limitation. The innocent person cannot make genuine moral choices because they do not understand the difference between good and evil. They cannot take real responsibility for their actions because they act from impulse rather than conscious decision. They cannot love in the deepest sense because love requires the conscious choice to commit yourself to another person's well-being, even when it conflicts with your immediate desires. Innocence is peaceful, but it is also empty of the qualities that make human existence most meaningful: choice, responsibility, commitment, and authentic relationship. The transition from innocence to knowledge is therefore both necessary and irreversible. Once you become aware that you have choices, you can never return to the unconscious spontaneity of innocence. Once you understand that your actions have moral implications, you cannot go back to acting without considering the effects of your behavior on others. Once you recognize that you are responsible for creating your own meaning and direction in life, you cannot return to the simple acceptance of whatever circumstances provide. The knowledge of your own freedom transforms you permanently, and this transformation brings both burden and opportunity. This is why nostalgia for lost innocence, while understandable, is ultimately misguided. Adults who spend their time longing for the simplicity of childhood or trying to recapture the unconscious joy of earlier periods in their lives are attempting something that is both impossible and unworthy of their human potential. You cannot unknow what you know about choice, responsibility, and the complexity of human existence. The only path forward is through the anxiety and uncertainty that knowledge brings toward a more authentic and conscious form of existence. Kierkegaard illustrated this point through his analysis of the biblical story, but the same dynamic appears in every human life. Think about your own development from childhood through adolescence to adulthood. Each stage involved losing certain forms of innocence while gaining new capacities for understanding and choice. The carefree play of early childhood gave way to the social awareness of adolescence, which in turn evolved into the complex responsibilities of adult life. Each transition involved anxiety because each required you to give up familiar certainties and take on new uncertainties. But each transition also opened up new possibilities for growth, relationship, and meaningful action that were not available at earlier stages. The loss of innocence is particularly evident in moral development. Young children act according to immediate impulse and external rules, without fully understanding why certain actions are right or wrong. But as they mature, they begin to understand that moral choices involve consideration of other people's feelings, long-term consequences, and competing values that must be balanced against one another. This growing moral sophistication brings with it the burden of genuine responsibility and the anxiety that accompanies complex ethical decision-making. The child who breaks a rule feels guilty about being caught. The adult who faces a moral dilemma feels anxious about making the right choice. The adult's anxiety is more complex and more difficult to resolve, but it is also a sign of greater moral maturity and authentic engagement with ethical reality. The same pattern appears in emotional and relational development. The innocence of early romantic feelings gives way to the knowledge of love's complications, the need to balance personal desires with commitment to another person, the challenge of maintaining intimacy over time through inevitable changes and difficulties, the recognition that love requires not just feeling but also choice and action. This knowledge brings anxiety, because it reveals that successful relationships require ongoing effort, sacrifice, and the willingness to choose love even when feelings are complicated or difficult. But it also makes possible the deeper satisfactions of mature love that are not available to innocent infatuation. Kierkegaard's insight about the irreversibility of the transition from innocence to knowledge helps explain why certain modern attempts to solve human problems through simplification are doomed to failure. Whether it is political movements that promise to return to simpler times, religious movements that seek to recreate earlier forms of faith, or personal philosophies that advocate for the elimination of complexity and responsibility, these approaches all make the same fundamental error. They assume that you can solve the problems that knowledge brings by returning to innocence. But once consciousness has developed, the only path to peace and authenticity lies not in regression, but in learning to work constructively with the complexities that consciousness reveals. This is why Kierkegaard emphasized that the goal is not to eliminate anxiety, but to learn to be anxious in the right way. Anxiety is the emotional signature of consciousness, the feeling that accompanies our ongoing confrontation with choice, responsibility, and uncertainty. Since consciousness cannot be undone, anxiety cannot be eliminated without losing what is most essential to human existence. But anxiety can be transformed from a source of paralysis into a source of guidance, from an obstacle to growth into a teacher that helps us navigate the complex terrain of conscious existence. The paradox of innocence and knowledge ultimately points toward a truth about human nature that is both humbling and empowering. We are beings who cannot remain innocent without remaining incomplete, but who cannot gain completeness without losing innocence. This means that growth and development necessarily involve loss as well as gain, anxiety as well as joy. But it also means that the anxiety we feel when facing life's complexities is not a sign that something has gone wrong, but evidence that something essentially human is working right. We feel anxious because we are capable of choice, responsibility, and authentic existence. Learning to embrace this anxiety as a teacher, rather than fighting it as an enemy, is one of the most important tasks of human life. Part 7. The Birth of Self-Consciousness, From Immediacy to Reflection. The moment a human being becomes aware of themselves as a choosing, thinking, responsible agent marks one of the most profound transitions in all of existence. Kierkegaard understood that the birth of self-consciousness represents a qualitative leap that forever changes the nature of human experience. Before this awakening, we exist in what he called immediacy, living spontaneously without internal distance or reflection. After this awakening, we become beings capable of stepping back from ourselves, observing our own thoughts and actions, and taking responsibility for who we choose to become. This transition, while opening up the possibility of authentic existence, also introduces anxiety as a permanent feature of human consciousness. To understand what Kierkegaard meant by immediacy, think about those moments in your life when you were completely absorbed in an activity. Perhaps you were playing a sport, creating art, or engaged in deep conversation with someone you love. In these moments, there was no gap between yourself and your activity, no internal observer commenting on your performance, no self-consciousness about how you appeared to others. You simply were the activity you were engaged in, existing in a state of natural unity between intention and action, thought and reality. This is a taste of what immediacy feels like, though true immediacy involves living in this state consistently rather than just experiencing it occasionally. But human beings cannot remain in immediacy indefinitely because we are the kinds of creatures capable of reflection. Sooner or later, usually gradually, but sometimes suddenly, we develop the capacity to observe ourselves from the outside. We begin to notice our own thoughts, evaluate our own actions, and imagine how we appear to others. We start asking questions like, who am I? And what do I really want? And am I living the right kind of life? These questions mark the birth of self-consciousness, the emergence of what Kierkegaard called the capacity for relating oneself to oneself. This capacity for self-reflection is simultaneously the source of human greatness and human suffering. It is what allows us to transcend our immediate circumstances, imagine alternative possibilities, and take responsibility for shaping our own existence. But it is also what introduces the gap between self and experience that makes anxiety possible. Once you can observe yourself from the outside, you can also judge yourself, worry about whether you are living correctly, and feel uncertain about who you really are beneath all your various roles and activities. The very capacity that makes authentic existence possible also makes authentic existence a problem that must be constantly worked out rather than simply lived. Kierkegaard recognized that this transition from immediacy to self-consciousness typically happens gradually through a series of experiences that force us to become aware of ourselves as separate from our circumstances. The first time a child realizes that their parents might be wrong about something important, they begin to understand that they must think for themselves rather than simply accepting external authority. The first time a young person questions whether the values they were raised with actually reflect their own deepest convictions, they begin the lifelong process of self-creation. The first time anyone recognizes that they have been living according to others' expectations rather than their own authentic desires, they confront the necessity of choosing who they want to become. Each of these experiences involves anxiety because each requires letting go of the security of unconscious existence and taking on the responsibility of conscious choice. But the transition to self-consciousness also reveals something remarkable about human nature. We are beings who exist in relationship not just to others, but to ourselves. This internal relationship between the self that observes and the self that acts becomes the foundation for all genuine growth and development. Through self-consciousness, you can evaluate your own behavior, recognize patterns you want to change, and work intentionally toward becoming the kind of person you want to be. You can reflect on your values and commitments to ensure they align with your deepest convictions rather than just your immediate impulses or social pressures. You can take responsibility for your own emotional and spiritual development rather than simply reacting to whatever circumstances provide. This capacity for self-relationship also makes possible the distinctly human forms of suffering that Kierkegaard analyzed so brilliantly. Animals can experience pain and distress, but only self-conscious beings can experience guilt, shame, regret, and the particular form of anxiety that comes from uncertainty about one's own identity and purpose. These forms of suffering arise precisely from our ability to step back from immediate experience and evaluate ourselves according to standards that transcend the present moment. You feel guilty when you recognize that your actions conflict with your values. You feel ashamed when you see yourself falling short of who you want to be. You feel anxious when you confront the gap between your current reality and your potential for growth. Yet Kierkegaard insisted that these distinctly human forms of suffering are not mistakes to be eliminated, but signs of our capacity for authentic existence. The anxiety that accompanies self-consciousness is evidence that you are capable of transcending your immediate circumstances and taking responsibility for your own development. The internal tension between who you are and who you could become is what motivates growth, change, and the ongoing project of self-creation that defines human life. Without this tension, you would remain forever in the unconscious simplicity of immediacy. Neither good nor evil, neither authentic nor inauthentic, neither growing nor declining. Modern psychology has extensively documented the development of self-awareness in children and its crucial role in healthy psychological development. Research shows that the capacity for self-reflection emerges gradually through the first several years of life and continues developing throughout adolescence and into adulthood. This development involves both cognitive changes, the growing ability to think about thinking, and emotional changes, the increasing capacity to regulate and direct one's own emotional responses. The anxiety that often accompanies adolescence and young adulthood reflects the intensive period during which young people are developing their capacity for self-consciousness and learning to navigate its complexities. Kierkegaard's analysis helps explain why attempts to escape self-consciousness through various forms of unconsciousness, whether through substance abuse, mindless entertainment, or simply refusing to think about life's deeper questions, are ultimately self-defeating. Once you have developed the capacity for self-reflection, you cannot permanently return to immediacy without losing what is most essentially human about yourself. The only path forward is to learn to work constructively with self-consciousness, using it as a tool for growth rather than a source of paralysis. This means accepting the anxiety that comes with self-awareness as a necessary companion on the journey toward authentic existence. The birth of self-consciousness also explains why isolation and relationship are both necessary for human development. You need solitude to develop your capacity for self-reflection and to work out your own understanding of who you are and who you want to become. But you also need relationship with others to provide external perspectives that help you see yourself more clearly and to practice being authentic in the context of real human connection. The anxiety that often accompanies both solitude and relationship reflects the challenges involved in maintaining authentic selfhood while also engaging genuinely with others who are working out their own complex processes of self-development. Understanding self-consciousness as both gift and burden helps explain why Kierkegaard saw anxiety as fundamentally educational rather than pathological. Anxiety teaches us about our own capacity for choice and responsibility. It alerts us to gaps between our current reality and our potential for growth. It motivates us to work on becoming more authentic versions of ourselves. Learning to read anxiety's messages rather than simply trying to eliminate its discomfort is essential for anyone who wants to live a genuinely human life. The goal is not to return to the unconsciousness of immediacy, but to move forward toward a more conscious and intentional way of existing that honors both our capacity for reflection and our need for authentic action. Part 8. Learning to be anxious in the right way. Anxiety as teacher. Whoever has learned to be anxious in the right way has learned the ultimate. This single sentence from Kierkegaard contains what might be the most important practical wisdom in all of human psychology. But what does it mean to be anxious in the right way? And how do we distinguish constructive anxiety from the destructive forms that can paralyze and overwhelm us? Understanding this distinction is crucial not only for psychological health, but for spiritual growth and authentic living. Kierkegaard discovered that anxiety, when properly understood and engaged, becomes one of our most important teachers about freedom, responsibility, and the nature of authentic existence. The key to understanding right anxiety lies in recognizing that anxiety is fundamentally different from fear in its relationship to learning and growth. When you feel fear, your natural response is to avoid or eliminate the source of threat. If you are afraid of heights, you avoid tall buildings. If you are afraid of rejection, you avoid taking social risks. If you are afraid of failure, you avoid challenging situations. These responses make perfect sense when dealing with genuine external dangers, but they become problematic when applied to anxiety because anxiety is not pointing toward external threats to be avoided. Instead, anxiety is pointing towards internal realities about freedom and responsibility that need to be understood and embraced rather than escaped. Right anxiety involves learning to stay present with the feeling rather than immediately trying to make it go away. When you feel anxious about an important life decision, your first impulse might be to distract yourself, seek reassurance from others, or postpone the decision until the feeling subsides. But Kierkegaard would suggest that the anxiety itself contains valuable information about the significance of the choice you are facing and your own capacity to shape your existence through that choice. Instead of avoiding the anxiety, you can learn to listen to what it is telling you about your freedom, your values, and your potential for growth. Consider the anxiety that often accompanies major life transitions: graduating from school, starting a new job, getting married, having children, or facing retirement. In each case, the anxiety is not really about the specific practical challenges involved, though those may certainly contribute to your overall stress level. The deeper anxiety is about the fact that you are becoming someone you have never been before, taking on new responsibilities and possibilities that will require you to discover capacities you may not know you possess. This anxiety is pointing toward the exciting and frightening reality of human growth and self-transformation. Learning to be anxious in the right way means recognizing this anxiety as a sign that you are evolving rather than as evidence that something is wrong. Right anxiety also involves distinguishing between the anxiety that comes from freedom and the anxiety that comes from avoiding freedom. When you feel anxious because you are contemplating a choice that would require you to take more responsibility for your own existence, that anxiety is pointing you toward growth and authenticity. But when you feel anxious because you are avoiding choices and trying to maintain situations that no longer serve your development, that anxiety is pointing you toward the need to act more courageously. The first type of anxiety says, "This choice matters and will change you." The second type says, "You are avoiding choices that you need to make." Learning to distinguish between these two messages is essential for using anxiety as a guide, rather than being overwhelmed by it. Kierkegaard also understood that right anxiety requires developing what he called the courage to be oneself. This means learning to trust your own capacity to grow and adapt to the consequences of your choices, rather than demanding certainty before you act. Much of the anxiety that paralyzes people comes from the desire to know in advance exactly how their choices will turn out, and to guarantee that they will not make mistakes or experience regret. But such certainty is impossible in human life, because genuine choices involve becoming someone new rather than just selecting among predetermined options. Right anxiety accepts this uncertainty as the natural condition of free beings and uses it as motivation to develop your capacities for wisdom, resilience and adaptation, rather than as an excuse for avoiding commitment. The educational function of anxiety becomes particularly clear when we examine how it operates in moral development. When you face a situation where you could take the easy path that compromises your values, or the difficult path that honors your deepest convictions, the anxiety you feel is not just about the practical consequences of your choice. It is about your relationship to yourself and your capacity to live with integrity. The anxiety is teaching you about what really matters to you, what you are willing to sacrifice for, and who you want to become through your actions. People who learn to be anxious in the right way use these moments of moral anxiety as opportunities to clarify their values and strengthen their commitment to authentic living. Right anxiety also involves learning to distinguish between productive worry and destructive rumination. Productive anxiety motivates you to prepare carefully for important challenges. Consider the perspectives of others who might be affected by your choices and develop contingency plans for potential difficulties. It helps you take responsibility seriously without becoming paralyzed by perfectionism. Destructive anxiety, on the other hand, involves endless circular thinking that generates more anxiety without leading to constructive action. Learning the difference requires developing what therapists call tolerance for uncertainty, the ability to act wisely despite incomplete information rather than demanding impossible levels of certainty before making important choices. Modern research in psychology has validated many of Kierkegaard's insights about the relationship between anxiety and growth. Studies show that moderate levels of anxiety can enhance performance, motivation and learning, while very low or very high levels of anxiety tend to be counterproductive. This finding parallels Kierkegaard's insight that the goal is not to eliminate anxiety, but to find the right relationship to it. Research on post-traumatic growth has also shown that people who learn to work constructively with anxiety and uncertainty often develop greater resilience, deeper relationships and more authentic life priorities than they had before facing difficult challenges. This suggests that anxiety, when engaged properly, can indeed serve as a teacher that guides us toward more meaningful and authentic existence. Perhaps most importantly, learning to be anxious in the right way involves recognizing anxiety as a companion rather than an enemy on the journey of human development. Just as physical pain alerts you to potential bodily harm and motivates you to take protective action, existential anxiety alerts you to situations that require careful attention to your freedom and responsibility. The goal is not to eliminate this natural warning system, but to learn to interpret its messages accurately and respond to them wisely. This means developing the capacity to sit with uncertainty, to act courageously despite incomplete knowledge, and to trust your own ability to learn and grow through whatever consequences your choices may bring. When anxiety is understood and engaged in this way, it becomes not an obstacle to authentic living, but one of the most reliable guides available for navigating the complex terrain of human existence. Part 9. The connection between anxiety and despair, two faces of freedom. In the landscape of human consciousness, anxiety and despair are like two neighbouring countries that share a long and complicated border. Kierkegaard understood that these two profound emotional experiences are intimately connected, both arising from our uniquely human capacity for freedom, yet pointing in different directions for our development. While anxiety emerges when we confront our potential for authentic choice and self-creation, despair emerges when we misuse that freedom or refuse to embrace it fully. Understanding the relationship between these two experiences is crucial for anyone seeking to live an authentic human life. Despair, in Kierkegaard's analysis, is fundamentally about the failure to achieve a proper relationship with oneself. He defined despair as not willing to be oneself, or alternatively as willing to be oneself, in a way that denies essential aspects of human nature. This might seem abstract, but it points toward very concrete realities in human experience. Think about times when you have felt deeply dissatisfied with your life, not because of external circumstances, but because of a sense that you are not living as your authentic self. Perhaps you were pursuing goals that others expected of you, rather than goals that reflected your own deepest values. Perhaps you were avoiding challenges that would require you to grow because growth felt too risky or demanding. Perhaps you were trying to be someone other than who you actually are, because your authentic self seemed inadequate or unacceptable. These experiences reflect different forms of despair, different ways of failing to achieve a healthy relationship with your own existence. The connection between anxiety and despair becomes clear when we recognize that both emerge from our confrontation with freedom, but they represent different responses to that confrontation. Anxiety arises when you face the open possibilities of your existence and feel the weight of responsibility that comes with genuine choice. This anxiety can either motivate you toward growth and authenticity, or it can overwhelm you in ways that lead to despair. If you respond to anxiety by embracing the challenge of self-creation, anxiety becomes a teacher that guides you toward more authentic existence. But if you respond to anxiety by trying to escape the burden of freedom, you end up in various forms of despair that actually make your situation worse rather than better. One common form of despair involves what Kierkegaard called the despair of possibility. This occurs when you become so overwhelmed by the scope of your freedom that you retreat into endless fantasy and speculation rather than making concrete choices. People in this form of despair are constantly imagining different ways their lives could unfold, but never committing to any particular path. They live in their heads rather than in reality, using their imagination to avoid the anxiety that comes with actual decision-making and commitment. While this might provide temporary relief from anxiety, it ultimately leads to a deeper form of suffering because you end up living a life of pure possibility without ever actualizing your potential in concrete ways. The opposite form of despair involves the despair of necessity, where you convince yourself that you have no real choices and must simply accept whatever circumstances provide. People in this form of despair often say things like, "I had no choice," or "that's just the way things are," when faced with situations that actually do offer alternatives. This form of despair provides relief from anxiety by denying the reality of freedom, but it comes at the cost of authentic existence. When you convince yourself that you are not really free to choose, you also give up the possibility of creating a life that reflects your values and aspirations. You become a passive victim of circumstances rather than an active agent in your own existence. Both forms of despair represent attempts to escape the anxiety that comes with authentic freedom, but both ultimately fail because they involve denying essential aspects of human nature. The person who lives only in possibility never experiences the satisfaction of actualizing their potential in concrete ways. The person who denies the reality of choice never experiences the pride and fulfillment that come from taking responsibility for their own existence. In both cases, the attempt to avoid anxiety leads to a more profound form of suffering because it involves cutting yourself off from what makes human life most meaningful. Kierkegaard also identified what he called the despair of not willing to be oneself and the despair of willing to be oneself. The first involves rejecting your actual nature, limitations, and circumstances in favor of trying to be someone completely different. This might manifest as constantly comparing yourself to others and feeling inadequate, or as pursuing goals that have nothing to do with your actual talents and interests, because you cannot accept who you really are. The second involves a kind of stubborn insistence on being yourself without regard for growth, change, or relationship with others. This might manifest as refusing to adapt to new circumstances, rejecting feedback from others, or insisting that everyone else should accommodate your limitations rather than working to develop yourself. In both cases, despair involves a fundamental misunderstanding of what it means to be human. Authentic existence requires both self-acceptance and self-transcendence, both embracing who you are and working to become who you could be. You must accept your limitations while also recognizing your potential for growth. You must honor your individual nature while also remaining open to relationship and change. This dynamic balance cannot be achieved through simple formulas or rules, but must be worked out through the ongoing process of living consciously and making authentic choices despite uncertainty. The relationship between anxiety and despair also explains why attempts to eliminate anxiety often backfire. When you try to avoid the anxiety that comes with genuine choice and responsibility, you often end up in forms of despair that are more problematic than the original anxiety. This is why Kierkegaard insisted that the goal is not to eliminate anxiety, but to learn to be anxious in the right way. Anxiety that motivates you toward growth and authenticity is preferable to despair that cuts you off from your own potential for development. Modern psychology has extensively documented the relationship between anxiety disorders and depression, finding that they often occur together and may share underlying mechanisms. While clinical depression and existential despair are not identical, Kierkegaard's insights about the connection between anxiety and despair remain relevant for understanding how people respond to the fundamental challenges of existence. Research shows that people who learn to tolerate uncertainty and embrace challenges despite anxiety tend to have better mental health outcomes than those who avoid anxiety through rigid control or avoidance strategies. This supports Kierkegaard's insight that the relationship between anxiety and despair depends largely on how we respond to the anxiety that inevitably accompanies human freedom. Perhaps most importantly, understanding the connection between anxiety and despair helps explain why courage is such a crucial virtue for human flourishing. Courage is not the absence of anxiety, but the willingness to act authentically despite anxiety. When you choose to face the anxiety that comes with genuine choice and responsibility, rather than escaping into various forms of despair, you open up the possibility of living a life that reflects your deepest values and aspirations. This requires what Kierkegaard called the leap, the willingness to act despite uncertainty and to trust your own capacity to learn and grow through whatever consequences your choices may bring. Learning to make this leap consistently, using anxiety as a guide rather than an obstacle, is perhaps the most important skill for anyone seeking to live an authentic and fulfilling human life. Part 10. Modern Existential Therapy, Kierkegaard's Living Legacy. In therapy offices around the world today, people struggling with anxiety, depression and questions of meaning are discovering insights that would be immediately recognizable to Søren Kierkegaard. Modern existential therapy, which emerged in the 20th century through the work of pioneering therapists influenced by existential philosophy, represents the direct application of Kierkegaardian insights to the practice of healing and human development. Understanding how Kierkegaard's analysis of anxiety has been translated into therapeutic practice reveals not only the practical wisdom of his insights, but also their continuing relevance for contemporary struggles with mental health and authentic living. The founders of existential therapy, including figures like Ludwig Binswanger, Rollo May, and Irvin Yalom, recognized that traditional approaches to psychology often missed something essential about human suffering. While symptom-focused treatments might provide temporary relief, they frequently failed to address the deeper existential concerns that underlay many psychological problems. People came to therapy not just because they were experiencing anxiety or depression in a clinical sense, but because they were struggling with fundamental questions about meaning, purpose, freedom, and authenticity. These therapists realized that Kierkegaard's analysis of anxiety as the emotional signature of human freedom provided a much more adequate framework for understanding and addressing these concerns than traditional medical models of mental illness. Existential therapy approaches anxiety very differently than conventional treatments. Instead of viewing anxiety primarily as a symptom to be eliminated, existential therapists understand it as potentially meaningful information about the client's relationship to their own freedom and responsibility. When someone comes to therapy feeling anxious about a major life decision, the therapist does not immediately try to reduce the anxiety through relaxation techniques or cognitive restructuring. Instead, they help the client explore what the anxiety might be teaching them about the significance of the choice they are facing and their own capacity for authentic self-determination. This approach treats anxiety as a teacher rather than an enemy, exactly as Kierkegaard suggested. Consider how an existential therapist might work with someone experiencing career-related anxiety. Rather than focusing primarily on stress management techniques or practical problem-solving strategies, the therapist would help the client explore deeper questions. What does this anxiety reveal about your values and priorities? What aspects of your current situation conflict with your authentic self? What possibilities for growth and self-expression are you considering, and what fears are holding you back from pursuing them? How might this period of uncertainty actually be an opportunity to clarify who you want to become and what kind of life you want to create? These questions reflect Kierkegaard's insight that anxiety often arises at moments when we are being called to take greater responsibility for our own existence. Existential therapy also emphasizes what Kierkegaard called the leap, the recognition that authentic choices cannot be made through analysis alone, but require courage and commitment despite uncertainty. Many people who struggle with anxiety are caught in endless loops of analysis, trying to think their way to certainty before making important decisions. Existential therapists help clients recognize that this endless thinking can become a way of avoiding the responsibility that comes with genuine choice. They work with clients to develop tolerance for uncertainty and the capacity to act authentically despite incomplete information. This involves learning to trust your own ability to grow and adapt to whatever consequences your choices may bring, rather than demanding guarantees before you act. The therapeutic relationship itself in existential therapy reflects Kierkegaard's insights about the importance of authentic human encounter. Rather than positioning themselves as expert diagnosticians who can objectively analyze the client's problems, existential therapists understand themselves as fellow human beings who are also struggling with the fundamental challenges of existence. This creates what therapists call a real relationship, where both therapist and client are engaged as authentic persons rather than playing predetermined roles. The therapist's own humanity, including their own struggles with anxiety and uncertainty, becomes a resource for helping the client recognize that these experiences are part of the human condition rather than signs of personal failure. Existential therapy also addresses what Kierkegaard analyzed as the relationship between anxiety and despair. Many clients come to therapy not just with anxiety, but with deeper feelings of meaninglessness, emptiness, or disconnection from their authentic selves. Existential therapists help clients understand these experiences as forms of despair that often arise from attempts to avoid the anxiety that comes with authentic choice and responsibility. Rather than treating despair as a separate disorder, they help clients see how it connects to their relationship with their own freedom and potential for self-creation. This often involves helping clients identify ways they have been living inauthentically avoiding choices, following others' expectations, or denying their own capacity for growth and then supporting them in taking steps toward more authentic existence, despite the anxiety this may initially increase. Research on the effectiveness of existential therapy has consistently shown positive outcomes for people struggling with a wide range of concerns, from clinical anxiety and depression to broader questions of life satisfaction and meaning. Studies have found that existential approaches are particularly effective for people facing major life transitions, dealing with loss and grief, or struggling with what researchers call existential anxiety, concerns about meaning, mortality, freedom and isolation that may not fit neatly into traditional diagnostic categories. This research validates Kierkegaard's insight that addressing these deeper existential concerns is often more important for human flourishing than simply treating surface symptoms. One of the most significant contributions of existential therapy has been its influence on other therapeutic approaches. Even therapists who do not identify primarily as existential practitioners have increasingly incorporated insights about the importance of meaning, authentic relationship, and client agency into their work. Cognitive behavioral therapy, for example, has evolved to include more attention to values clarification and behavioral activation based on personally meaningful goals rather than just symptom reduction. Mindfulness-based approaches often emphasize acceptance of uncertainty and present-moment awareness in ways that parallel existential themes. This broader influence reflects the fundamental truth of Kierkegaard's insights about the centrality of freedom, choice, and authentic existence in human psychology. Perhaps most importantly, existential therapy has helped restore dignity to human suffering by treating it as meaningful rather than merely pathological. When someone experiences anxiety about major life choices, existential therapy helps them understand this as evidence of their capacity for freedom and authentic existence rather than as a sign that something is wrong with them. When someone struggles with questions of meaning and purpose, existential therapy treats these concerns as legitimate and important rather than as symptoms to be medicated away. This approach reflects Kierkegaard's fundamental insight that the anxieties and struggles that accompany conscious existence are not bugs in the system of human nature, but features that point toward our unique capacity for growth, choice, and authentic self-creation. In a world that often seeks quick fixes and simple solutions, existential therapy preserves space for the complexity and depth of human experience, honoring both the difficulties and the possibilities that come with being conscious, free, and responsible beings. Part 11. Neuroscience meets Kierkegaard, the brain science of existential anxiety. For nearly 2 centuries, Kierkegaard's insights about anxiety remained primarily in the realm of philosophy and psychology. But in recent decades, advances in neuroscience have begun to reveal the biological foundations of the very experiences that Kierkegaard analyzed so brilliantly. Modern brain imaging technology allows us to observe what happens in the human brain when people confront uncertainty, make difficult choices, and experience the kind of existential anxiety that Kierkegaard described. Remarkably, these scientific discoveries largely confirm and extend his psychological insights rather than contradicting them. Neuroscientists have identified specific brain circuits involved in processing different types of threat and uncertainty. When you face a clear, immediate danger, like an approaching car, your brain's fear circuits activate quickly and efficiently to mobilize your body for fight or flight responses. These circuits include the amygdala, which detects threats, and various brainstem regions that coordinate rapid physiological responses like increased heart rate and muscle tension. This system works beautifully for handling concrete external dangers, but it was not designed to deal with the open-ended uncertainties that characterize human existence. Existential anxiety involves different brain networks that are associated with self-reflection, future planning, and what neuroscientists call default mode processing. When you contemplate major life decisions or wrestle with questions about meaning and purpose, you activate brain regions including the prefrontal cortex, which is involved in complex reasoning and planning, and the anterior cingulate cortex, which monitors conflicts between different mental processes. These regions work together to help you simulate possible futures, evaluate different options, and integrate emotional and rational considerations in decision-making. But they also generate the subjective experience of uncertainty and mental effort that we recognize as existential anxiety. Research has shown that people vary significantly in how their brains respond to uncertainty and ambiguity. Some individuals have neural patterns that make them more comfortable with open-ended situations, while others show greater activation in anxiety-related brain regions when facing unclear choices. These differences help explain why some people seem naturally more adventurous and willing to take risks, while others prefer structure and predictability. But importantly, the research also shows that these neural patterns can change through experience and practice, suggesting that Kierkegaard's insight about learning to be anxious in the right way has a biological foundation. One of the most fascinating discoveries concerns what happens in the brain during moments of insight and decision-making. When people have breakthrough moments where clarity emerges from confusion, or when they finally commit to important choices after periods of uncertainty, there are characteristic patterns of brain activity that suggest the integration of multiple neural networks. These moments appear to involve what neuroscientists call neural phase transitions, sudden reorganizations of brain activity that create new patterns of connectivity and information processing. This provides a biological basis for understanding what Kierkegaard called the leap, the qualitative transition from reflection to action that cannot be accomplished through gradual logical steps. Neuroscience has also revealed important differences between anxiety disorders as clinically understood and the kind of existential anxiety that Kierkegaard analyzed. Clinical anxiety disorders often involve overactivation of threat detection systems and difficulties with emotional regulation that can be addressed through medication and targeted therapies. But existential anxiety appears to involve normal activation of brain systems responsible for complex cognition, self-reflection, and future planning. This suggests that existential anxiety is not a malfunction of the brain, but rather the natural consequence of using our most sophisticated cognitive capacities to grapple with genuinely complex and uncertain aspects of human existence. The neuroscience of decision-making has also provided insights into why choice can be both exhilarating and overwhelming. When you contemplate multiple options for how to live your life, your brain must coordinate enormous amounts of information about values, goals, relationships, practical constraints, and potential consequences. This processing requires significant neural resources and can create a subjective experience of mental fatigue and uncertainty. But the same neural processes that generate this experience also enable the remarkable human capacity for self-direction and authentic choice that Kierkegaard celebrated. Research on neuroplasticity. The brain's capacity to change and adapt throughout life has provided a biological foundation for understanding personal growth and self-transformation. When you make choices that require you to develop new capacities or adapt to new circumstances, your brain literally rewires itself to support these changes. This process involves the growth of new neural connections, changes in the strength of existing connections, and sometimes even the generation of new brain cells. The anxiety that often accompanies personal growth may reflect the brain's recognition that significant reorganization is required, but it also signals the remarkable plasticity that makes authentic development possible throughout life. Studies of meditation and mindfulness practices have shown that training attention and awareness can alter brain function in ways that support better responses to uncertainty and anxiety. People who practice mindfulness show increased activity in brain regions associated with present moment awareness and decreased reactivity in regions associated with rumination and worry. This research supports Kierkegaard's insight that the quality of your relationship to anxiety matters more than the simple presence or absence of anxious feelings. By learning to observe anxiety with curiosity, rather than immediately trying to escape it, you can develop neural patterns that support greater resilience and wisdom in facing life's uncertainties. Perhaps most remarkably, neuroscience research has begun to reveal the biological basis of what philosophers call self-transcendence, the capacity to act according to values and commitments that extend beyond immediate self-interest. When people make choices based on deeply held principles or long-term goals rather than immediate impulses, there are characteristic patterns of brain activity that involve communication between emotional centers and higher-order cognitive regions. This provides a neural foundation for understanding what Kierkegaard meant by authentic existence, the capacity to live according to your deepest convictions rather than simply reacting to circumstances. The integration of neuroscience with existential insights does not reduce human experience to mere brain activity, but it does provide additional validation for Kierkegaard's psychological observations. The fact that existential anxiety involves normal rather than pathological brain function supports his view that such anxiety is a natural and potentially valuable aspect of human consciousness. The evidence for neural plasticity confirms his insight that people can learn to relate to anxiety more constructively. And the research on decision-making and self-transcendence provides biological foundations for understanding the capacity for authentic choice and moral development that he considered central to human nature. Rather than contradicting Kierkegaard's insights, modern neuroscience helps us understand the remarkable biological machinery that makes possible the experiences of freedom, responsibility, and authentic existence that he analyzed so brilliantly. Part 12. Anxiety in the Digital Age. New Freedoms, New Anxieties. If Kierkegaard thought the modern world of his time created unprecedented levels of anxiety, he could hardly have imagined the psychological landscape of the 21st century. The digital revolution has created forms of freedom and possibility that would have been unthinkable in 19th century Denmark, but it has also generated new sources of existential anxiety that require fresh applications of Kierkegaardian insights. Understanding how technology amplifies the fundamental tensions between freedom and security, possibility and commitment, authentic selfhood and social conformity can help us navigate the unique challenges of contemporary existence. The Internet has created what we might call the anxiety of infinite possibility. Previous generations had relatively limited information about career options, potential romantic partners, places to live, or ways to spend their time. While this limitation could feel constraining, it also provided a kind of security by naturally narrowing the scope of choices that needed to be made. Today, a young person can research thousands of career paths, connect with potential partners from around the world, and access more information about possible life directions than any previous generation in human history. This expansion of possibility is genuinely liberating in many ways, but it also creates what Kierkegaard would recognize as a form of anxiety that comes from confronting the sheer scope of human freedom. Social media platforms have created entirely new arenas for the performance of identity and the comparison of lives. Where previous generations might have compared themselves primarily to neighbours and local community members, people today are constantly exposed to curated versions of lives from around the world. This creates what we might call comparison anxiety, a form of existential unease that arises from the recognition that you could potentially be living any number of different lives that appear more exciting, successful or fulfilling than your current reality. The anxiety here is not just about missing out on specific opportunities, but about the deeper question of whether you're making the right choices about who to become and how to live. The speed and connectivity of digital communication have also created new forms of what Kierkegaard called the anxiety of being observed. When every conversation can be screenshotted, every opinion can be publicly shared, and every mistake can be permanently recorded, the sense of being constantly watched and judged intensifies the self-consciousness that Kierkegaard identified as both the source of human greatness and human suffering. This heightened visibility can make authentic self-expression more difficult, because the stakes of being genuinely yourself feel higher when your authenticity might be subject to public scrutiny by unlimited numbers of strangers. The digital age has also complicated the relationship between authentic selfhood and social connection. Online platforms allow people to connect with others who share their interests and values in ways that were impossible before the internet, creating opportunities for more authentic relationships and communities. But these same platforms often reward performance and image management over genuine vulnerability and growth. The result can be a kind of authenticity anxiety, where people feel pressure to be genuine while simultaneously crafting their online presence for maximum social approval. This creates the exhausting double bind of trying to be authentic in contexts that reward careful self-curation. Information overload has created what we might call knowledge anxiety, a form of existential unease that comes from having access to more information than any individual can possibly process or integrate. Previous generations might have struggled with limited access to information, but today's challenge is often the opposite: how to make wise decisions when you have access to unlimited information that often contradicts itself and changes rapidly. This creates a particular form of the anxiety that Kierkegaard associated with choice, not just the difficulty of choosing among options, but the difficulty of even determining what the options are when the information landscape is constantly shifting. The speed of technological change has also created obsolescence anxiety, the fear that your skills, knowledge, or way of life might become irrelevant faster than you can adapt. This is not just practical concern about career security, though that is certainly part of it, but existential anxiety about the stability of identity itself. When the economic, social and technological foundations of life change rapidly, it becomes harder to develop the kind of stable sense of self that allows for long-term commitments and authentic relationships. People may feel anxious not just about what choices to make, but about whether any choices they make will remain relevant long enough to provide meaning and direction. Yet the digital age has also created new opportunities for the kind of authentic existence that Kierkegaard advocated. Technology can be used to facilitate deeper self-reflection through journaling apps, meditation programs, and online communities focused on personal growth and meaningful living. It can connect people with mentors, teachers, and like-minded communities that support authentic development. It can provide access to educational resources, creative tools, and platforms for expression that allow people to explore and develop their authentic interests and capabilities. The key insight from Kierkegaard's perspective is that technology itself is neither good nor bad for authentic existence, but the way we choose to use it can either support or undermine our capacity for genuine selfhood. The challenge of living authentically in the digital age requires what we might call digital wisdom, the capacity to use technology in ways that support rather than undermine your deepest values and commitments. This means learning to recognize when online activities are genuinely enriching your life, and when they are serving as distractions from the hard work of authentic existence. It means developing the capacity to maintain real relationships and genuine commitments despite the constant availability of alternatives and distractions. It means learning to tolerate the anxiety that comes with missing out on some possibilities in order to commit fully to the possibilities you choose to pursue. Perhaps most importantly, the digital age requires new applications of Kierkegaard's insight about learning to be anxious in the right way. The anxiety that comes from confronting unlimited possibilities, constant comparison opportunities, and rapid change can either paralyze us into endless browsing and option evaluating, or it can motivate us to make more conscious and intentional choices about how we want to live. The goal is not to eliminate the anxiety that comes with digital age freedom, but to use that anxiety as information about what matters most to us, and motivation to live according to our deepest convictions, rather than simply reacting to whatever captures our attention. In this sense, the digital age offers both unprecedented challenges and unprecedented opportunities for the kind of authentic existence that Kierkegaard believed was the highest human calling. Part 13. The courage to be yourself. Authenticity in a conformist world. In a world that constantly pressures us to fit in, follow trends, and meet others' expectations, the simple act of being yourself becomes a profound form of courage. Kierkegaard understood that authenticity is not a natural state that we simply need to uncover, but an achievement that requires ongoing effort and the willingness to face the anxiety that comes with standing apart from the crowd. The courage to be yourself involves accepting the responsibility of self-creation while resisting the powerful social forces that encourage conformity and mediocrity. This courage becomes both more necessary and more difficult in contemporary society, where the pressures to conform are often subtle but pervasive. Authentic existence begins with the recognition that you are not simply the product of your circumstances, upbringing, or social environment. While these factors certainly influence who you are, they do not determine who you must become. You have the capacity to reflect on your inherited beliefs, values, and patterns of behavior, and to consciously choose which aspects of your background to embrace and which to transcend. This recognition can be simultaneously liberating and terrifying because it places the responsibility for your life's direction squarely on your own shoulders. You cannot blame your parents, your society, or your circumstances for living inauthentically if you recognize that you have the power to choose how to respond to these influences. The anxiety that accompanies authentic living often intensifies when your authentic choices conflict with social expectations or conventional wisdom. Perhaps you feel called to pursue a creative career despite pressure to choose something more financially secure. Perhaps your authentic values lead you to live more simply, while others around you are focused on material accumulation. Perhaps your genuine interests and passions differ from what is fashionable or socially approved in your community. In each case, choosing authenticity over conformity requires facing the anxiety that comes with potential disapproval, misunderstanding, or isolation from others. Kierkegaard understood that this social pressure toward conformity operates not just through explicit demands, but through what he called the crowd, or the public. These abstract social forces create an atmosphere where being different feels dangerous, even when there are no specific consequences for non-conformity. The crowd operates through subtle mechanisms like social media algorithms that reward popular content, workplace cultures that discourage questioning conventional approaches, or social environments where expressing unpopular opinions leads to awkward silence. These pressures can be more powerful than explicit rules because they work on our deep human need for belonging and acceptance. Resisting these pressures requires what Kierkegaard called the courage to be a single individual, rather than losing yourself in mass consciousness. This does not mean becoming antisocial or rejecting all forms of community and relationship. Instead, it means maintaining your capacity for independent thought and authentic choice, even while participating in social relationships and institutions. You can be part of communities and organizations without allowing them to define your identity or determine your values. You can care about others' opinions and feedback without making their approval the primary criterion for your life choices. Authentic existence also requires distinguishing between your genuine self and the various roles you play in different contexts. You might be a parent, a professional, a community member, and a friend, but none of these roles completely captures who you are as a person. Each role involves certain expectations and responsibilities that you should take seriously. But authentic living means choosing how to fulfill these roles in ways that align with your deeper values and convictions. You can be a responsible employee without sacrificing your personal integrity. You can be a caring parent without losing your individual identity. You can be a good friend without pretending to be someone you are not. The process of discovering and expressing your authentic self is not a one-time achievement, but an ongoing practice that requires constant attention and adjustment. As you grow and change throughout your life, your understanding of who you are and who you want to become will also evolve. Authenticity therefore involves the capacity to remain connected to your evolving self, rather than getting trapped in outdated self-concepts or others' expectations based on who you used to be. This requires the flexibility to change when change serves your growth, and the stability to maintain your core commitments when external pressures encourage you to abandon them. One of the most challenging aspects of authentic living involves learning to tolerate the loneliness that sometimes accompanies being true to yourself. When your authentic choices lead you away from conventional paths, you may find yourself feeling isolated from friends and family members who do not understand your decisions. This loneliness can create pressure to compromise your authenticity in order to restore social connection. But Kierkegaard understood that this loneliness, while difficult, is often temporary and can lead to deeper and more meaningful relationships with people who appreciate and support your authentic self. Learning to tolerate this temporary isolation while remaining open to genuine connection is crucial for anyone committed to authentic existence. The courage to be yourself also involves accepting that authenticity does not guarantee external success or social approval. Living according to your deepest convictions may lead to career setbacks, relationship challenges, or social misunderstanding. Authentic existence requires the willingness to accept these potential costs, because you recognize that the alternative, living inauthentically to please others or achieve conventional success, ultimately leads to a more profound form of failure. You may gain the whole world but lose your soul, as the ancient wisdom suggests. The anxiety that comes with choosing authenticity over external reward reflects the real stakes involved in these decisions. Yet Kierkegaard also recognized that authentic existence brings its own rewards that cannot be achieved through conformity or external achievement alone. When you live according to your genuine values and convictions, you experience a form of self-respect and inner peace that does not depend on others' approval or external circumstances. You develop resilience because your sense of worth comes from internal rather than external sources. You attract relationships based on genuine compatibility rather than superficial similarities or mutual convenience. Most importantly, you experience the deep satisfaction of knowing that your life reflects your authentic choices, rather than simply the path of least resistance. The courage to be yourself ultimately requires recognizing that authenticity is not a luxury for those who have already achieved security and success, but a necessity for anyone who wants to live a genuinely human life. In a world that often rewards conformity and punishes difference, choosing authenticity becomes a form of resistance to dehumanizing forces. The anxiety you feel when contemplating authentic choices is not a sign that you should avoid those choices, but evidence that you are confronting something significant and meaningful. Learning to use this anxiety as a guide toward greater authenticity rather than as a warning to retreat into conformity is perhaps the most important skill for anyone seeking to live with courage and integrity in the modern world. Part 14. Anxiety and Creativity. The artist's confrontation with freedom. Artists, writers, musicians, and creators of all kinds live in an intimate relationship with the anxiety that Kierkegaard analyzed so brilliantly. Every blank canvas, empty page, or silent instrument represents a confrontation with pure possibility and the dizzying freedom to create something that has never existed before. Understanding the connection between anxiety and creativity reveals why artistic work often feels both exhilarating and terrifying, and why the greatest creative achievements often emerge from periods of profound uncertainty and existential questioning. The creative process offers a unique window into the dynamics of freedom, choice, and authentic self-expression that Kierkegaard saw as central to human existence. Creative anxiety differs from ordinary worry in precisely the way that Kierkegaard distinguished existential anxiety from fear. When you sit down to write a poem, compose a song, or paint a picture, you are not afraid of any specific external threat. Instead, you are confronting the vast space of possibility and the responsibility of bringing something meaningful into existence through your choices. The anxiety that many artists describe before beginning work reflects the recognition that they are about to engage in an act of creation that cannot be predetermined or controlled through pure technique. They must make choices about form, content, style and meaning without knowing in advance whether their choices will result in something beautiful, meaningful or worthwhile. This creative anxiety intensifies because artistic work involves expressing something essential about yourself through your creations. Unlike following a predetermined recipe or solving a mathematical problem, creative work requires you to draw on your own experiences, perspectives, and vision in ways that reveal who you are. When you create something and share it with others, you are making yourself vulnerable to judgment, not just about your technical skills, but about your inner life and authentic self. The anxiety that accompanies this vulnerability reflects the same tension between authenticity and social approval that Kierkegaard identified as central to human existence. Many artists describe experiencing what they call the blank page syndrome or writer's block, forms of creative paralysis that often arise from confronting the sheer scope of possibilities available in any creative project. From a Kierkegaardian perspective, these experiences reflect the overwhelming nature of creative freedom, rather than simple lack of inspiration or technique. When you face unlimited possibilities for what you could create, the very richness of options can become paralyzing rather than liberating. Learning to work creatively requires developing the capacity to make choices and commit to specific directions despite uncertainty about whether those choices are optimal. This mirrors the broader challenge of living authentically, learning to act decisively despite incomplete knowledge and uncertain outcomes. The relationship between anxiety and creativity also explains why many artists find that their best work emerges during periods of personal struggle or existential questioning. When life feels settled and secure, there may be less motivation to engage in the difficult work of creative exploration and self-expression. But when you are grappling with loss, transition, uncertainty, or profound questions about meaning and purpose, the urgency of these concerns often translates into creative energy. The anxiety that accompanies life transitions and existential questioning can become raw material for artistic work that explores universal themes of human experience. Artists often find that their most meaningful creations emerge from their willingness to transform personal anxiety into shared expression that speaks to others who are facing similar challenges. This transformative relationship between anxiety and creativity reflects what Kierkegaard understood about the educational function of anxiety in human development. Just as existential anxiety can teach us about our capacity for freedom and authentic choice, creative anxiety can teach us about our capacity for original expression and meaningful contribution. When you work through the uncertainty and vulnerability that creative work involves, you develop confidence in your ability to generate something valuable from the raw materials of your own experience and imagination. This confidence then extends beyond artistic work to other areas of life where creativity and original thinking are valuable. The creative process also offers a unique laboratory for practicing what Kierkegaard called the leap, the transition from reflection to action that cannot be accomplished through analysis alone. At some point in any creative project, you must stop planning and researching and begin actually creating, even though you cannot know in advance exactly what you will produce. This leap from possibility to actuality requires the same kind of courage and commitment that Kierkegaard saw as essential to authentic living. Artists who learn to make this leap consistently in their creative work often find that this capacity transfers to other areas of life where decisive action despite uncertainty is required. Creative communities and artistic traditions provide models for how to work constructively with anxiety rather than being paralyzed by it. Experienced artists often develop practices and rituals that help them begin work despite creative anxiety. Writers who commit to writing a certain number of words each day regardless of quality, painters who begin each session with exercises to overcome perfectionism, musicians who improvise to reconnect with spontaneous expression. These practices reflect an understanding that creative anxiety cannot be eliminated but can be channeled into productive rather than paralyzing directions. The goal is not to feel completely confident before beginning creative work, but to develop the capacity to work creatively despite anxiety and uncertainty. The connection between anxiety and creativity also explains why exposure to art and artistic expression can be so valuable for people struggling with existential questions and life challenges. When you encounter a poem, painting, song or story that captures something essential about human experience, you realize that others have faced similar anxieties and found ways to transform them into meaningful expression. Art provides evidence that suffering and uncertainty can be converted into beauty and meaning rather than simply endured. This can offer hope and inspiration for your own process of working constructively with the anxiety that accompanies authentic existence. Perhaps most importantly, the relationship between anxiety and creativity reveals that the capacity for original expression and meaningful contribution is not limited to professional artists, but is available to anyone willing to engage authentically with their own experience. Whether you express yourself through traditional artistic mediums or through the way you approach your work, relationships and daily life, you have the opportunity to transform anxiety into creative energy. The key insight from both Kierkegaard and artistic practice is that anxiety often signals the presence of something important trying to emerge. Learning to pay attention to this signal and respond creatively rather than defensively can transform anxiety from an obstacle into an ally in the ongoing project of creating a meaningful and authentic life. Part 15. The Social Dimension: Anxiety, Relationships and Authentic Connection. Human beings are fundamentally social creatures. Yet our deepest relationships often become sources of the very anxiety that Kierkegaard analysed so perceptively. The tension between maintaining authentic selfhood and connecting genuinely with others creates some of the most complex challenges in human existence. Understanding how anxiety operates in relationships and social contexts reveals why love, friendship and community can be simultaneously the most fulfilling and most anxiety-provoking aspects of human life. Navigating these social dimensions of anxiety requires wisdom about when to adapt yourself to others and when to maintain your authentic independence. The anxiety that accompanies intimate relationships often begins with what we might call vulnerability anxiety, the recognition that love requires making yourself emotionally exposed to another person who has the power to hurt you. When you allow someone to see your fears, insecurities, hopes and dreams, you are taking a leap similar to the existential leap that Kierkegaard described in Individual Choice. You cannot know in advance whether your vulnerability will be met with acceptance and care or with rejection and judgment. But without this vulnerability, relationships remain superficial and fail to provide the deep connection that makes love meaningful. Learning to tolerate vulnerability anxiety while remaining open to authentic connection is one of the most important skills for relational success. Kierkegaard understood that authentic relationships require what he called transparency, the capacity to be genuinely yourself with another person rather than performing a version of yourself designed to gain approval. But transparency creates its own form of anxiety because it involves revealing aspects of yourself that you might prefer to keep hidden. You might worry that your authentic self is not lovable enough, interesting enough, or attractive enough to maintain another person's affection. This creates pressure to present an idealized version of yourself in relationships, but such presentation ultimately undermines the genuine connection you are seeking. The paradox is that the very authenticity that makes you anxious in relationships is also what makes real intimacy possible. Relationships also generate anxiety through what we might call freedom conflict situations, where your authentic choices conflict with your partner's needs or expectations. Perhaps you feel called to pursue a career change that would require sacrifices from your family. Perhaps your partner wants a level of social activity that feels inauthentic to your introverted nature. Perhaps your values lead you in directions that create tension with your closest relationships. These conflicts cannot be resolved through simple compromise because they involve fundamental questions about who you are and who you are becoming. Learning to navigate these conflicts without either sacrificing your authenticity or destroying your relationships requires the kind of courage and wisdom that Kierkegaard saw as essential to human flourishing. The social context of modern life creates additional layers of relational anxiety through what we might call performance pressure. Social media and digital communication often encourage presenting curated versions of your relationships rather than their complex reality. This can create anxiety about whether your actual relationships measure up to the idealized versions you see others presenting online. It can also create pressure to document and share your relational experiences in ways that transform private moments into public performances. The anxiety that results from this constant performance reflects the tension between authentic connection and social approval that Kierkegaard identified as central to modern existence. Friendship presents its own unique forms of social anxiety, particularly around questions of loyalty, authenticity, and mutual growth. True friendship requires supporting others' authentic development even when their growth leads them in directions that differ from your own path. You might feel anxious when a close friend makes life choices that you would not make for yourself, or when their evolution creates distance between your previously shared perspectives. Learning to maintain authentic friendship through these changes requires the capacity to love others for who they are becoming rather than trying to keep them as who they were when your friendship began. This reflects the same challenge that exists in romantic relationships, balancing acceptance and growth, stability and change. Community involvement and social participation create their own forms of anxiety related to what Kierkegaard called the tension between the individual and the universal. When you participate in organizations, causes, or social movements, you face the challenge of contributing to collective efforts while maintaining your individual integrity and authentic voice. You might feel anxious about expressing perspectives that differ from group consensus, or about the pressure to conform to group identity in ways that compromise your personal values. But you might also feel anxious about remaining too independent and failing to contribute meaningfully to causes and communities that matter to you. Navigating this tension requires what we might call authentic participation, the capacity to engage genuinely with others while maintaining your individual responsibility for your own choices and commitments. Parenting represents perhaps the most complex intersection of anxiety, relationships, and authentic existence. As a parent, you must balance your responsibility to guide and protect your children with respect for their emerging autonomy and authentic development. You cannot make authentic choices for your children, but you also cannot abandon your responsibility to provide structure, values, and guidance. This creates ongoing anxiety about whether you are being too controlling or too permissive, too protective or too demanding. The deeper anxiety involves recognizing that your children must ultimately face the same existential challenges that you face. Learning to make authentic choices despite uncertainty and taking responsibility for their own existence. Learning to tolerate this anxiety while supporting your children's development requires a profound form of love that honors both connection and freedom. Working through relational anxiety constructively requires developing what we might call relational wisdom, the capacity to distinguish between anxiety that signals genuine problems and anxiety that simply reflects the natural challenges of authentic connection. Some anxiety in relationships indicates real issues that need attention, violations of trust, incompatible values, or patterns of behavior that undermine genuine intimacy. But other anxiety simply reflects the inherent challenges of maintaining authentic selfhood while creating genuine connection with other autonomous beings. Learning to work constructively with this second type of anxiety, rather than trying to eliminate it through control or avoidance, is essential for developing the kind of relationships that support, rather than compromise, authentic existence. Perhaps most importantly, understanding the social dimensions of anxiety helps clarify why isolation is not the solution to relational challenges. While solitude is necessary for self-reflection and authentic development, human beings need relationship and community to fully realize their potential for growth and meaning. The goal is not to avoid the anxiety that comes with genuine connection, but to learn to work with that anxiety in ways that deepen rather than compromise both authenticity and intimacy. This requires the recognition that the best relationships are those that support each person's authentic development, rather than requiring them to sacrifice their individuality for the sake of connection. When relationships operate in this way, the anxiety that they generate becomes a source of growth and deepening rather than a threat to be eliminated. Part 16. Teaching and Learning in the Age of Anxiety. Educational Implications. Every teacher who has stood before a classroom full of students has experienced a particular form of anxiety that reflects some of the deepest challenges in human development. How do you help young people learn to think for themselves while providing them with the knowledge and guidance they need? How do you prepare them for a world of uncertainty and change while giving them confidence in their ability to navigate that uncertainty? Kierkegaard's insights about anxiety and authentic existence have profound implications for education, suggesting that the goal of learning should not be the elimination of uncertainty, but the development of wisdom for living creatively with uncertainty. Traditional educational approaches often try to reduce student anxiety by providing clear rules, definite answers, and predictable paths to success. While structure and guidance are certainly important, Kierkegaard's analysis suggests that this approach may inadvertently prepare students for a world that does not exist. A world where important questions have clear answers and where following predetermined formulas guarantees success. Real life requires the capacity to make good decisions despite incomplete information, to adapt to changing circumstances, and to take responsibility for choices that may not work out as planned. These capacities can only be developed by gradually increasing students' exposure to authentic challenges that require them to think independently and take responsibility for their own learning. The anxiety that students often experience when facing open-ended projects, complex problems, or questions that do not have single correct answers reflects their confrontation with the kind of freedom that Kierkegaard analyzed. When a teacher asks students to develop their own research question rather than answering predetermined questions, or to create an original project rather than following detailed instructions, students must take responsibility for their own learning process in ways that can feel overwhelming. But this anxiety often signals that genuine learning is taking place. Learning that involves developing the capacity for independent thought and authentic engagement rather than simply mastering predetermined content. Effective educators learn to distinguish between productive anxiety that motivates learning and counterproductive anxiety that paralyzes students. Productive anxiety emerges when students are challenged to stretch their capabilities while still having adequate support and resources for success. This kind of anxiety motivates effort, encourages creative problem-solving, and builds confidence through achievement. Counterproductive anxiety emerges when students feel overwhelmed by expectations they cannot meet or abandoned without adequate guidance and support. The art of teaching involves calibrating challenge and support so that students experience enough anxiety to motivate growth without so much that they become paralyzed or defeated. Kierkegaard's insights about the relationship between anxiety and freedom suggest that students need opportunities to make genuine choices about their learning rather than simply following prescribed curricula. When students can choose topics that genuinely interest them, select projects that connect to their authentic concerns, and pursue questions that emerge from their own curiosity, they develop the capacity for self-directed learning that will serve them throughout their lives. These opportunities also generate the kind of anxiety that comes with responsibility for one's own development, rather than simply meeting external expectations. Learning to work constructively with this anxiety is itself an important educational outcome that prepares students for the lifelong process of growth and adaptation. The concept of failure in educational contexts takes on new meaning when viewed through Kierkegaard's lens. Traditional education often treats mistakes and failed attempts as problems to be minimized rather than as valuable sources of learning. But Kierkegaard's analysis suggests that the anxiety around potential failure often reflects students' confrontation with the genuine stakes involved in learning and growth. When students are allowed to take real risks in their learning, to pursue challenging projects that might not succeed, to express controversial ideas that might be criticized, to attempt creative work that might fall short of their aspirations, they develop resilience and authentic confidence that cannot be gained through guaranteed success. Educational environments that honour both individual development and collaborative learning reflect Kierkegaard's insights about the tension between authenticity and social connection. Students need opportunities for solitary reflection and independent work to develop their capacity for autonomous thought and authentic self-expression. But they also need opportunities for genuine collaboration and dialogue to test their ideas against others' perspectives and to learn from different approaches to common challenges. The anxiety that often accompanies group work, especially when it involves sharing original ideas or receiving feedback from peers, reflects the same vulnerability that characterizes all authentic relationships. Learning to work constructively with this anxiety prepares students for the lifelong challenge of maintaining authentic individuality while contributing meaningfully to communities and collaborative efforts. Teacher education and professional development take on new dimensions when informed by Kierkegaardian insights about anxiety and authenticity. Teachers who understand their own relationship to anxiety and uncertainty are better equipped to help students navigate similar challenges. This means that teacher preparation should include opportunities for educators to explore their own capacity for authentic existence, to practice tolerating uncertainty and ambiguity, and to develop wisdom about when to provide guidance and when to encourage independent exploration. Teachers who are comfortable with their own ongoing learning and growth model for students the kind of lifelong development that education should ultimately serve. Assessment and evaluation practices require fundamental reconsideration when viewed through the lens of existential development. While measuring specific knowledge and skills remains important, education that takes anxiety and authenticity seriously must also find ways to assess students' capacity for independent thinking, creative problem-solving, and responsible decision-making. This might involve portfolio approaches that document growth over time, self-assessment practices that encourage reflection on learning processes, and performance-based assessments that require students to apply their learning to novel and complex situations. The goal is to help students develop internal standards for evaluating their own work and progress rather than depending entirely on external validation. Perhaps most importantly, educational approaches informed by Kierkegaard's insights recognize that the ultimate goal of learning is not the accumulation of information, but the development of wisdom for living authentically in an uncertain and changing world. This means helping students develop capacities for critical thinking, creative expression, ethical reasoning, and collaborative problem-solving that will serve them regardless of specific career paths or life circumstances. It means teaching them to see anxiety not as a sign of failure, but as a natural companion on the journey of growth and learning. Most importantly, it means modelling for students that education is not a preparation for life, but a way of engaging fully with life as it actually is. Complex, uncertain, challenging and full of possibilities for meaningful contribution and authentic existence. Part 17. Cultural and Historical Perspectives. Anxiety across time and place. Anxiety, while universal to human experience, manifests differently across cultures and historical periods, revealing how social context shapes our relationship to freedom, choice and authentic existence. Kierkegaard's analysis of anxiety emerged from his particular time and place, 19th century Denmark undergoing rapid modernization. But his insights can help us understand how different societies create different forms of existential challenge and possibility. Examining anxiety through cultural and historical lenses reveals both the universal aspects of human freedom and the particular ways that social conditions can either support or undermine authentic existence. In traditional societies with stable social roles, clear hierarchies, and widely shared religious or cultural narratives, the anxiety that Kierkegaard described might be less prominent in daily experience. When your role in life is largely determined by birth, when community traditions provide clear guidance for most decisions, and when shared beliefs offer ready-made answers to questions about meaning and purpose, there may be less confrontation with the dizzying scope of individual freedom. However, this apparent security often comes at the cost of authentic self-development and individual expression. People in such contexts might experience different forms of anxiety related to failing to fulfill predetermined roles or questioning accepted authorities and traditions. The transition to modernity that Kierkegaard witnessed in his own lifetime involved the gradual dissolution of many traditional sources of meaning and guidance. As religious authority weakened, social hierarchies became more fluid, and individual choice became more valued. People gained new freedoms, but also new burdens. The anxiety that accompanies this transition reflects what sociologists call anomie, the experience of living without clear social norms and shared values to guide behaviour. Kierkegaard's analysis of anxiety can be seen as an early recognition of the psychological consequences of modernization. Greater freedom brings greater responsibility, and therefore greater anxiety. Contemporary global culture presents unique challenges for managing existential anxiety because it combines unprecedented individual freedom with constant exposure to alternative ways of living. Social media and global communication make people aware of lifestyle options, career possibilities, and life philosophies from around the world, creating what we might call cosmopolitan anxiety about whether they are making the best possible choices given the vast array of alternatives. Traditional cultures might have provided the security of limited options, but contemporary culture often provides the anxiety of unlimited options. This creates new demands for the kind of wisdom that Kierkegaard advocated, learning to make authentic choices despite uncertainty and the constant availability of alternatives. Different cultural attitudes toward individualism and collectivism also shape how anxiety manifests and how it can be addressed constructively. Cultures that emphasize individual achievement and personal responsibility might create more of the individual anxiety that Kierkegaard analyzed, but they might also provide more support for authentic self-development. Cultures that emphasize social harmony and collective identity might create less individual anxiety, but more anxiety about maintaining social relationships and meeting group expectations. Understanding these cultural variations can help people recognize that their particular forms of anxiety reflect not just personal characteristics, but also the social context in which they are embedded. Economic systems and social structures create different forms of existential anxiety, depending on how they balance security and freedom. Highly regulated societies with extensive social safety nets might reduce anxiety about basic survival, but increase anxiety about individual expression and authentic choice. Highly competitive societies with minimal social support might increase anxiety about survival and success, but provide more opportunities for individual self-determination. Neither extreme is optimal for human flourishing. The challenge is creating social conditions that provide adequate security while preserving meaningful opportunities for authentic existence. Religious and spiritual traditions offer different frameworks for understanding and working with anxiety, some of which align closely with Kierkegaardian insights, while others take very different approaches. Some traditions emphasize surrendering individual will to divine authority as a way of finding peace, which might reduce certain forms of anxiety but could also inhibit authentic self-development. Other traditions emphasize individual spiritual development and direct experience of ultimate reality, which might increase short-term anxiety but support long-term growth and authentic existence. Understanding these different approaches can help individuals find spiritual resources that support rather than undermine their capacity for authentic living. The pace of social and technological change in contemporary society creates what we might call historical anxiety about the relevance and stability of any particular way of life. Previous generations could assume that the knowledge, skills and values that served them well would also serve their children. But today's rapid change makes such assumptions problematic. This creates anxiety, not just about personal choices, but about the foundations of choice itself. What values should guide decisions when traditional authorities are questioned and when the future is increasingly unpredictable? Kierkegaard's emphasis on individual responsibility and authentic choice becomes particularly relevant in contexts where external authorities provide less reliable guidance. Cross-cultural psychology research has revealed both universal and culture-specific aspects of anxiety and mental health, supporting Kierkegaard's insight that anxiety reflects fundamental aspects of human nature, while also showing how social context shapes its expression. Studies show that all cultures recognize some form of anxiety-related distress, but the specific symptoms, triggers and coping strategies vary significantly across societies. This suggests that while the capacity for anxiety reflects universal aspects of human consciousness, the particular forms it takes depend heavily on social and cultural factors. Understanding this interaction between universal and particular aspects of anxiety can help individuals and societies develop more effective approaches to supporting human flourishing. Perhaps most importantly, examining anxiety across cultures and historical periods reveals that there is no single correct way to organize society to minimize anxiety while maximizing authentic existence. Every social arrangement involves trade-offs between security and freedom, individual expression and social cohesion, tradition and innovation. The goal is not to eliminate anxiety, which would be impossible for conscious, free beings, but to create social conditions that support people in working constructively with anxiety rather than being overwhelmed by it. This requires ongoing attention to how social institutions, cultural values, and economic arrangements either support or undermine the capacity for authentic existence that Kierkegaard saw as the highest human calling. By understanding anxiety as a universal aspect of human consciousness that manifests differently in different contexts, we can work toward creating societies that honor both individual authenticity and collective flourishing. Part 18. The Paradox of Growth: Why Development Requires Discomfort. One of the most counterintuitive insights to emerge from Kierkegaard's analysis of anxiety is that psychological and spiritual growth necessarily involves discomfort, uncertainty, and the willingness to tolerate temporary distress for the sake of long-term development. This paradox challenges our natural tendency to seek comfort and avoid pain, suggesting instead that the very experiences we most want to avoid may be essential for becoming who we are capable of becoming. Understanding this paradox can transform how we approach personal development, relationships, and life challenges, turning obstacles into opportunities and anxiety into a guide for growth. The paradox begins with the recognition that growth always involves moving from the known to the unknown, from familiar competence to temporary incompetence, from the security of current limitations to the uncertainty of expanded possibilities. When you learn a new skill, whether it is playing an instrument, speaking a foreign language, or developing emotional intelligence, you must necessarily go through a period where you are worse at the new thing than you were at your old ways of functioning. This temporary incompetence creates anxiety because it threatens your sense of self-efficacy and exposes you to potential failure or embarrassment. But without tolerating this discomfort, you cannot access new capacities and possibilities for development. The same dynamic operates in psychological and spiritual growth. When you recognize patterns in your life that no longer serve you, whether they involve relationships, career choices, or personal habits, you face the anxiety of giving up familiar ways of being for unknown alternatives. Even when your current patterns are limiting or harmful, they provide a certain security because they are predictable and known. The prospect of change, even positive change, creates anxiety because it requires letting go of your current identity and taking on the uncertainty of becoming someone new. This is why people often resist growth even when they consciously want to change. The anxiety of transformation can feel more threatening than the dissatisfaction of remaining stuck. Kierkegaard's insight about learning to be anxious in the right way becomes crucial for navigating this growth paradox. The anxiety that accompanies growth opportunities is not a signal to retreat, but information about the significance of the step you are considering. When you feel anxious about taking on a new challenge, expressing a difficult truth, or making a change that would require you to expand your capabilities, that anxiety often indicates that you are approaching something important for your development. Learning to interpret anxiety as a guide rather than a warning can help you move toward growth rather than away from it. The discomfort of growth also involves what psychologists call cognitive dissonance, the mental tension that arises when new information or experiences conflict with existing beliefs or self-concepts. When you encounter perspectives that challenge your worldview, feedback that contradicts your self-image, or experiences that do not fit your expectations, you face the choice between maintaining your current understanding and expanding to accommodate new information. The anxiety that accompanies this choice reflects the genuine difficulty of transforming your mental frameworks rather than simply adding new information to existing categories. But this transformation is essential for growth because it allows you to develop more accurate and comprehensive understanding of yourself and your world. Relationship growth provides particularly clear examples of the growth paradox. Deepening intimacy requires increasing vulnerability, which necessarily increases the potential for hurt and disappointment. Developing more authentic relationships often means having difficult conversations, setting boundaries, or expressing needs that might not be well received. Expanding your capacity for love often involves facing your own limitations, fears, and defensive patterns that have previously protected you from relational risk. Each of these relationship challenges creates anxiety, but avoiding them keeps you trapped in superficial connections that cannot provide the deep fulfillment that authentic relationship offers. The growth paradox also explains why many therapeutic approaches emphasize the importance of sitting with difficult emotions rather than immediately trying to fix or eliminate them. When you feel anxious, depressed, angry, or afraid, your natural impulse is often to escape these feelings as quickly as possible through distraction, substances, or compulsive activities. But these emotions often contain important information about your needs, values, and areas where growth is needed. Learning to tolerate emotional discomfort long enough to understand what it is teaching you can lead to insights and changes that eliminate the underlying causes of distress rather than just providing temporary relief from symptoms. Physical fitness provides a useful analogy for understanding the growth paradox in other areas of life. Building strength and endurance requires progressively challenging your muscles beyond their current capacity, which necessarily involves temporary discomfort and fatigue. If you only exercise at levels that feel completely comfortable, you will not develop new capabilities. But if you push too hard too fast, you risk injury and setbacks. The art of physical development involves finding the optimal level of challenge that promotes growth without causing harm. The same principle applies to psychological and spiritual development. You need enough challenge to stimulate growth, but enough support and recovery to integrate new capabilities without becoming overwhelmed. Understanding the growth paradox also helps explain why periods of crisis and difficulty often become turning points for positive development. When life circumstances force you to confront limitations in your current ways of thinking and functioning, you may develop new capacities that would not have emerged under comfortable conditions. This does not mean that suffering is inherently valuable, but it does suggest that how you respond to unavoidable difficulties can determine whether they become sources of breakdown or breakthrough. The anxiety that accompanies crisis often reflects your recognition that fundamental change may be required, and learning to work with this anxiety constructively can transform challenging periods into opportunities for significant growth. Perhaps most importantly, embracing the growth paradox can help you develop what psychologists call stress inoculation, the capacity to handle increasingly complex challenges because you have practiced working constructively with discomfort and uncertainty. Each time you choose growth despite anxiety, you build confidence in your ability to navigate uncertainty and adapt to new circumstances. This creates a positive cycle where your increasing capacity for handling challenge expands your range of possibilities for further development. Rather than seeking a life free from anxiety and discomfort, you can learn to seek a life that provides meaningful challenges that promote continued growth and authentic self-expression. This shift in perspective transforms anxiety from an obstacle to be avoided into a companion on the journey of becoming who you are capable of becoming. Part 19. Practical Wisdom. Daily Practices for Living with Existential Anxiety. Understanding. Kierkegaard's insights about anxiety is one thing. Learning to apply them constructively in daily life is another. The gap between philosophical understanding and practical wisdom requires developing specific practices and approaches that help you work with anxiety as a teacher rather than being overwhelmed by it as a problem. These practices do not eliminate anxiety, which would be impossible for conscious free beings, but they help you develop a more skillful and authentic relationship to the uncertainty that characterizes human existence. The goal is to cultivate what we might call anxiety literacy, the capacity to read anxiety's messages accurately and respond to them wisely. One of the most important practical skills involves learning to distinguish between different types of anxiety and responding appropriately to each. When you feel anxious, take a moment to ask yourself, is this anxiety pointing towards a genuine external threat that requires practical action, or is it pointing toward an internal reality about choice and responsibility that requires reflection and courage? If you are anxious about a specific upcoming event, like a job interview or medical test, you can channel that anxiety into practical preparation and problem solving. If you are anxious about deeper questions like whether you are living authentically or making the right major life choices, you need a different kind of response that honors the existential significance of what you are facing. Developing tolerance for uncertainty is perhaps the most crucial practical skill for working with existential anxiety. This involves practicing making decisions and commitments despite incomplete information rather than demanding certainty before you act. Start with small decisions where the stakes are relatively low. Choose a restaurant without reading every review, pick a movie without researching every detail, or select a weekend activity based on intuition rather than extensive analysis. As you build confidence in your ability to make good enough decisions without perfect information, you can gradually apply this capacity to more significant choices. The goal is not to become reckless, but to develop comfort with the level of uncertainty that accompanies all meaningful human choices. Creating regular practices for self-reflection helps you stay connected to your authentic values and priorities rather than getting swept along by external pressures and expectations. This might involve daily journaling, where you explore your thoughts and feelings without trying to solve problems immediately. Weekly reviews, where you assess whether your recent choices align with your deeper values, or monthly periods of deeper reflection, where you consider whether your life direction feels authentic and meaningful. The key is developing the habit of checking in with yourself regularly rather than only reflecting during times of crisis or major decision-making. This ongoing self-awareness helps you recognize when anxiety is signaling a need for course correction before problems become overwhelming. Learning to sit with difficult emotions without immediately trying to escape or fix them is another essential practice. When you feel anxious, try setting aside a specific period of time, perhaps 10 or 15 minutes, to simply observe the anxiety without judgment or problem solving. Notice how it feels in your body, what thoughts accompany it, and what it might be trying to tell you about your current situation or upcoming choices. This practice of emotional presence helps you develop tolerance for discomfort while also gathering valuable information about your inner life and authentic needs. Over time, this capacity for emotional presence reduces the power that difficult feelings have to control your behavior and increases your ability to respond thoughtfully rather than reactively. Developing what philosophers call existential courage requires practicing taking action despite anxiety rather than waiting for anxiety to disappear before you act. Identify areas in your life where you have been avoiding important choices or actions because they feel too uncertain or risky. Start with relatively small steps toward authentic living. expressing an opinion that differs from your social group, pursuing a creative interest that feels meaningful to you, or having a difficult but necessary conversation with someone important to you. Each time you act authentically, despite anxiety, you build confidence in your capacity to handle uncertainty and take responsibility for your own existence. This creates positive momentum that makes larger acts of existential courage feel more possible over time. Building supportive relationships that honor both authenticity and connection is crucial for navigating existential anxiety in sustainable ways. Seek out friends, mentors, or therapeutic relationships with people who can support your authentic development rather than pressuring you to conform to their expectations. Practice being genuinely yourself in relationships, sharing your real thoughts and feelings rather than performing versions of yourself designed to gain approval. Learn to offer the same kind of authentic support to others, honoring their autonomous development rather than trying to control or fix their choices. Relationships that support authentic existence provide both encouragement for growth and comfort during difficult periods of transition and uncertainty. Cultivating what we might call philosophical perspective helps you see your personal struggles in the broader context of universal human challenges. Reading literature, philosophy and psychology that explores themes of meaning, choice and authentic existence can help you recognize that your anxiety and uncertainty are part of the human condition rather than personal failures. Engaging with wisdom traditions from different cultures and historical periods can provide frameworks for understanding your experience and inspiration for working constructively with life's challenges. This broader perspective can reduce the isolation that often accompanies anxiety and provide hope that others have found ways to live meaningfully despite uncertainty. Developing practical skills for decision-making under uncertainty helps you take constructive action even when you cannot predict outcomes with certainty. This might involve learning to gather sufficient but not excessive information before making choices, practicing the art of good enough decisions rather than demanding perfection, and developing contingency plans that allow you to adapt when initial choices do not work out as expected. It also involves learning to evaluate decisions based on the quality of your decision-making process rather than only on outcomes, since many factors beyond your control influence how choices turn out. Perhaps most importantly, cultivating gratitude for your capacity to experience anxiety can transform your relationship to this fundamental aspect of human consciousness. Rather than seeing anxiety as an unfortunate burden, you can learn to appreciate it as evidence of your remarkable capacity for freedom, choice, and authentic self-determination. Only beings capable of transcending their immediate circumstances and imagining alternative possibilities could experience existential anxiety. When you feel anxious about important life choices, you are exercising capacities that make you uniquely human. The ability to reflect on your own existence, to consider different ways of living, and to take responsibility for shaping your own destiny. Learning to see anxiety in this light transforms it from an enemy to be defeated into a teacher, to be honored, a companion on the journey toward authentic and meaningful existence. Part 20. The Eternal Return to Anxiety, Embracing the Human Condition. As we reach the end of our journey through Kierkegaard's profound analysis of anxiety, we arrive at perhaps the most important insight of all. Anxiety is not a problem to be solved once and for all, but a permanent feature of conscious existence that must be engaged with throughout the entire span of a human life. The goal is not to reach a state where you never feel anxious again, but to develop an ongoing relationship with anxiety that transforms it from an obstacle into a guide for authentic living. This final understanding brings us full circle to the fundamental reality that sparked Kierkegaard's analysis. Being human means living in the constant tension between freedom and finitude, possibility and limitation, hope and uncertainty. Every major life transition will bring you face to face with anxiety again, regardless of how much wisdom and experience you have accumulated. When you graduate from school, start a new career, enter or end a significant relationship, become a parent, face illness or loss, or contemplate your own mortality, you will once again confront the dizzying reality of your freedom to choose how to respond to circumstances beyond your complete control. Each of these transitions requires you to become someone you have never been before, to develop capacities you may not know you possess, and to take responsibility for outcomes you cannot guarantee. The anxiety that accompanies these transitions is not a sign that you have failed to learn from previous experiences, but evidence that you are continuing to grow and face new challenges that matter. This recurring nature of anxiety reflects what Kierkegaard understood about the fundamental structure of human existence. We are beings suspended between the finite and the infinite, always in the process of becoming rather than simply being. Unlike animals that live according to instinct, or angels that would live according to perfect knowledge, human beings must navigate the complex terrain between determinism and freedom, between what is given and what is possible. This position brings both tremendous privilege and tremendous responsibility. We can shape our existence in ways that other creatures cannot, but we must do so without certainty about the ultimate meaning or outcome of our choices. Anxiety is the emotional signature of this unique position in existence, and it will remain with us as long as we remain capable of growth and choice. Understanding the eternal return of anxiety can actually be liberating rather than discouraging, because it frees you from the impossible goal of achieving a permanently anxiety-free existence. Instead of measuring your progress by the absence of anxiety, you can measure it by the quality of your relationship to anxiety, how quickly you recognize it as information rather than threat, how skillfully you interpret its messages, how courageously you act despite uncertainty, and how compassionately you treat yourself during periods of transition and growth. This shift in perspective transforms anxiety from a sign of failure into a sign of life, from evidence of weakness into evidence of your remarkable capacity for conscious existence. The cyclical nature of anxiety also means that the lessons you learn about working with it constructively will need to be relearned and reapplied throughout your life, often in deeper and more sophisticated ways. The anxiety you experienced as a young person choosing a career will have similarities to the anxiety you experience later when considering a career change, but it will also have new dimensions based on increased responsibilities, accumulated experience, and different life circumstances. Each encounter with significant anxiety offers an opportunity to deepen your understanding of yourself and your capacity for authentic choice, but it also requires fresh courage and renewed commitment to growth. You cannot coast on previous victories over anxiety, but must engage actively with each new challenge it presents. This ongoing engagement with anxiety becomes a kind of spiritual practice, a way of staying connected to the fundamental realities of human existence rather than getting lost in the illusion that life can be completely controlled or predicted. When you feel anxious about an important choice or life transition, you are being reminded of truths that are easy to forget during periods of stability and comfort, that your choices matter, that the future is genuinely open, that you have agency in shaping your existence, and that meaningful living requires courage rather than certainty. In this sense, anxiety serves as a kind of wake-up call that prevents you from sleepwalking through life or taking your freedom and agency for granted. The wisdom that emerges from a lifetime of working constructively with anxiety involves what we might call mature acceptance of the human condition. This is not passive resignation, but active embrace of both the difficulties and the possibilities that come with conscious existence. You learn to appreciate the anxiety that accompanies genuine choice as preferable to the numbness that comes from avoiding choice altogether. You develop gratitude for your capacity to feel uncertain because it reflects your capacity to imagine alternatives and take responsibility for your own development. You recognize that the discomfort of growth is a small price to pay for the privilege of becoming who you are capable of becoming. Perhaps most importantly, embracing the eternal return of anxiety leads to greater compassion, both for yourself and for others who are struggling with the fundamental challenges of human existence. When you recognize that anxiety is not a personal failing, but a universal aspect of conscious existence, you can treat your own struggles with greater kindness and understanding. When you see others grappling with uncertainty and difficult choices, you can offer support and encouragement rather than judgment or advice, based on the illusion that there are easy answers to complex questions. This compassionate understanding creates connections between people based on shared humanity rather than superficial similarities or competitive comparisons. The legacy of Kierkegaard's analysis of anxiety ultimately points toward a vision of human flourishing that embraces rather than denies the fundamental uncertainties of existence. Rather than seeking a life free from anxiety, we can seek a life rich with the kind of meaningful challenges that generate constructive anxiety. Authentic relationships that require vulnerability, creative work that demands original expression, moral choices that reflect our deepest values, and personal growth that expands our capacity for love and wisdom. This vision does not promise happiness in the conventional sense of constant pleasure and security, but it offers something deeper: the satisfaction of living authentically as the conscious, free, responsible beings that we are. In the end, Kierkegaard's great gift to human understanding lies not in providing answers to the questions that create anxiety, but in helping us see that anxiety itself points toward the most important realities of human existence: our capacity for choice, our responsibility for self-creation, and our potential for authentic relationship with ourselves, others, and the ultimate questions of meaning and purpose. Learning to be anxious in the right way, as he put it, means learning to live fully human lives in all their complexity, uncertainty, and possibility. This is perhaps the ultimate wisdom: that anxiety, properly understood and skillfully engaged, is not the enemy of authentic existence, but one of its most reliable guides. In embracing this truth, we honor both the difficulty and the glory of being human in a world that demands nothing less than our full participation in the ongoing adventure of consciousness, choice, and authentic self-creation.